Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It happened when I was 5. I was running around a playground, enjoying the summer like most little kids my age. I would chase my friends around the swing set, and then we'd all pile onto the slide, trying to make it to the bottom together. Our mothers watched from the benches, chatting with each other and keeping a watchful eye on our activity. I remember we were playing tag when I heard the dog barking. I stopped and wiped sweat from my forehead, gasping in air, hands on my grass-stained knees. Behind the playground was a patch of forest, an undeveloped plot of land. There was a dog biting at something just inside the tree line. I could hear the cries of pain from whatever the mutt was attacking. I had a soft spot for animals, and so I quickly bolted over and swatted the dog on the nose, scolding it and telling it to shoo. It was foolish of me, and I was lucky the dog didn't attack me. Instead, it whimpered and looked at me with sad brown eyes before running away. I turned my gaze to what the dog had been so interested in. My eyes went wide as they settled on the creature. It was small, maybe 2 feet tall, and covered with strange greenish skin. It had 2 arms and legs, like a person, but its face was bloated, and its 2 white eyes rolled around to look at me. It reminded me of a frog. I threw a look over my shoulder and gave my mom a reassuring wave. She had been calling me. She smiled and turned back to her conversation. I returned my attention to the strange creature as it was pulling itself off the ground to stand on its 2 webbed feet. I asked if it was okay, and to my amazement, it nodded. I noticed it was clutching something in its hand. It looked like a cluster of red ribbons. Strangely, they floated up from its grip to disappear into the air. I examined them, watching the way they fluttered in the summer breeze, trying to understand how they seemingly faded into nothing. It was like the creature was holding a bunch of invisible balloons, and I could only see the strings. I pointed to the ribbons and asked what they were. In my mind, this creature was just another magical discovery on the path to adulthood. I had no idea that my situation wasn't normal. I didn't know that eerie frog creatures weren't part of the natural order of things. The tiny frogman looked towards where I was pointing, at his plume of ribbons, and then back at me. I could see intelligence behind its strange, puffy eyes. It opened its mouth and spoke. "The clouds are hollow." Its voice was raspy and strained, like it was speaking in my language for the first time. I didn't know what it meant, what meaning the words held. And so I cocked my head and asked. It shook its handful of ribbons at me, their shiny red texture drifting from its grasp and fading into the gentle air. "The clouds are hollow," it repeated, clearly stressing every syllable. I giggled, unsure what else to do. It raised a 3-fingered hand and pointed to the distant horizon in the direction the ribbons were blowing. Clouds are coming. I was about to ask it another question, but my mom was calling me. I turned back to the frog creature and told it I had to go, but that it could come play with me if it wanted. It just stared at me, its eyes rolling over my face. It seemed like it was surprised I could see it. I waved a hand at it as I went back to my friends. I told them about my discovery, but when I pointed toward the tree line to show them my new pal, the creature was gone. Later that night, as I crawled into bed, listening to my parents talk from their bedroom, I heard something outside my window. It sounded like something was tapping the glass. I took a quick peek towards my door and then scuttled towards the window. I peered out into the darkness, looking for the source of the sound. Our house was only a single story, and so my view was filled with the backyard. A full moon glowed overhead, a golden badge on the dark fabric of night. And there was the strange frogman. His small 2-foot frame was outlined by the moon's white rays, its hand clasping the strange red ribbons. They looked longer now, though, as they flapped in the silent air. Earlier, they had disappeared mere inches from its fist, but now they blustered in the wind, 3 feet in length. I quietly opened my window and called out to the creature softly. It approached me without hesitation, as if it had expected me. I asked it what it was doing here. Its voice slid from its green lips like wet silk. Stay by me. The hollow clouds are coming. I looked over my shoulder and saw the shadow of my parents' door close along the hallway wall. They were going to sleep. I pulled myself up onto the windowsill and over the other side. My bare feet crunched down on the dead grass. The frogman pointed to his ribbons, which were visibly growing, climbing up into the sky like empty leashes. The thing motioned me to follow it, and I did without question. It was just so strange and exciting. This bizarre friend I had made. It led me around the house and into the cul-de-sac of my neighborhood, where my house resided. I looked around at the other dark homes, hoping none of my neighbors saw me out here. I'd be in big trouble if they did. Something tugged at my hand, and I saw the frogman pointing towards the sky, urgently. Look! The empty clouds. Sure enough, overhead, massive black clouds rolled across the empty sky. They were tall, like thunderheads, but that's where the similarities stopped. The clouds had cracks and holes in them, like hard-boiled eggs, and a strange red light emitted from the insides. My eyes widened in the night as I gazed up into their interior. White, bony ribs filled the dark clouds, lining the walls like gutless carcasses. Black ooze hung from the ebony formations of fractured cotton, and it reminded me of weeping willows. The silent masses chugged across the sky far above, looming over the neighborhood and blacking out the moon. Red light pulsed from the holes in the enclosed clouds, illuminating quick glances at the ribs inside. Drifting out of the bottom of the clouds were the red ribbons. I traced them down the sky, hundreds of feet, and saw that the strange creature was holding the other ends in his grip. "Take my hand," the frogman urged. I quickly grasped its three-fingered hand, surprised at how warm it was. No sooner had I done so than the clouds began to open up like gaping jaws. I saw the ribbons go taut in the creature's fist, and he adjusted his grip, his eyes trained in concentration at the evolving display. As the clouds opened, the ribs parted like teeth, and I felt the air swirl around me. My hair whipped up into my face, and I pushed it aside, my eyes wide and my heart racing in my chest. The clouds looked like dark, hungry mouths. Suddenly, floating out from the rooftops of my neighbors' houses, were the glowing forms of people. I gasped as I recognized them, encased in a soft red glow, eyes closed, and gently drifting up to the waiting maw. I cried out, turning around, and saw the forms of my parents drift out of my house and up into the sky. They looked like they were asleep and completely unaware of what was happening. I tried to run to them, panic suddenly erupting in my chest. But the frogman held me tight. I begged him to let me go, but he shook his bloated head violently. "Not you. Not you," it kept saying, struggling to maintain its grip on both me and its strange nightmare balloons. I watched in horror as the people continued to rise up into the sky, higher and higher, until they finally entered the waiting jaws. One by one, the clouds closed, once again forming dark, broken spheres in the night. Every single person who had been pulled up from their home was now trapped, unaware, inside the rolling black thunderheads. Tears rolled down my face as fear churned my insides. In confused horror, I watched as the red ribbons slowly began to disappear again. They faded from the clouds into invisibility the closer they got to the frogman's fist. After what seemed like forever, the creature let me go, his other hand clutching only inches of ribbon now. Crying, I asked him what he had done to my friends, my family. I demanded it, taking a step towards it in defiance. The thing raised a hand at me, trying to settle my hysterics. "It's okay. I took only..." It seemed to struggle to find the right words. "I took their after dead." I cried harder, begging him to release all the people. It shook its small head at me, its mouth a thin green line. "The hollow clouds need your people's after dead. If not..." Its eyes filled with a quiet fear. If not, I lose control. And they will never go away. The ribbons will be broken, uncontrolled. The jaws will never stop eating. I didn't understand any of this at the time. I didn't know what he was talking about. I just knew I wanted to get away from the frogman and the strange, horrible nightmare balloons it held. Look. The frogman pointed to the sky. They're leaving. I trained my head up and saw the towering black clouds begin to fade. Their great ribbed walls slowly starting to drift higher and higher up into the air, carried in the night towards the horizon. I looked back at the small creature next to me and saw it was still clutching the now tiny red ribbons. I wondered what would happen if he ever let them go. "Goodbye, little one," the thing suddenly said. It took one last look at me, and then began walking across the street towards the woods. I didn't watch as it disappeared into the night, but instead turned and sprinted back to my house, convinced I would find my parents gone. As I crashed back through my window and tore down the hallway, I prayed I wasn't alone. I prayed harder than I ever had. I banged open my parents' bedroom door, and to my utter relief, I saw them both jump up in their bed, the noise jolting them from slumber. I climbed up with them, weeping, babbling about what I had just seen, about what I had just been through. They shushed me with loving compassion and told me I just had a bad dream. They told me they were here for me. It's been 20 years since that night. I haven't forgotten a single detail of the horrors I witnessed. But some of the terror has gained clarity since then. I have no rational explanation for what happened. I don't have any resolution to the fear that's held me for decades. But as the years have advanced, I've begun to wonder. I've begun to wonder what will happen to my parents when they die. I wonder where their souls will go. And even more terrifying, if the hollow clouds return. Will the little frogman remember my kindness and save me a second time?
As a teacher, making the subject interesting was always the biggest challenge. But that was the bit of the job that I loved. And with some classes, it was really easy. Some students were just naturally interested in what made the world tick. Some got all starry-eyed at the idea of infinite universes, destructive black holes, chemical explosions, and classifying all the creepy crawlies that lived in the world. Some classes were harder to grab, though, and you had to really find something to pull them in. This was even more fun to figure out, like teaching taxonomical classifications using Pokemon, or using some sci-fi to explore the ideas of space and time, or sometimes just a good old-fashioned blowing something up. Every now and then, though, I'd get a really tough group. It was even worse when it came to teaching a subject that they found especially dull. One class in particular was an unholy boiling pot of hormone-fueled disruption. I would love to say that I didn't consider them bad kids, but the inbuilt liberal apologism most teachers have hardwired into them can only take so much punishment. They all had their reasons, of course. Broken homes, runaway parents, bad areas, drugs, alcohol, or just plain learning and development needs that we didn't have the time or the funds to accommodate properly. But with all the justification in the world, It didn't stop every lesson with them blurring that fine line between learning and riot control. I even approached my head of year for advice and support. He was normally a man who preached the gospel of no child left behind and every child matters with religious fervor. However, even he, having provided cover teaching for the group in a pinch, simply looked at me with sunken, defeated eyes and told me, "You're on your own with them, dude." The best he can offer would be to steer the school observations away from those classes and to cast a sympathetic eye over my end-of-year results. A token gesture that didn't stop the lessons from being a constant struggle to retain control. For instance, one kid, Jake, he took a lesson about evolution and survival of the fittest to be a personal challenge to his finely honed fighting skills, and the rest of the lesson was primarily concerned with me attempting to stop the class degenerating into a battle royale. I taught a lesson about the alkali metals, a family of metals which have a violent reaction with water, by putting a tiny pea-sized amount in a bowl of water and letting the class see it skitter around before popping with a tiny bang. This lesson was rewarded by a break-in to the chemical cupboard that night, and that was followed by a missing 100-gram block of potassium and a mysterious explosion that destroyed half the plumbing in the gym's shower block. I was out of ideas and at the end of my tether, and had resigned myself to simply embracing my new role as riot officer and condemning the class to oblivion. However, I had one of those soul-searching moments and thought that, no, everyone deserves one last chance. It was my class, my subject, and damn it, I was a grown man. I would not be defeated by a bunch of foul-mouthed little jerk-offs. I checked the curriculum, and the next subject to be taught would be sound waves. Ultrasound and subsonic waves in particular. So now all I had to find was the hook to draw them in. Had I known what would happen, I would have stopped right there. But I didn't. I plowed on, trying to find some way to make the subject of sound waves that you can't hear interesting. I found plenty of experiments using ultrasound to break glass. I didn't fancy giving them any excuse to break glass. Using it to break up kidney stones. The kids knew enough about weapons, thanks. Or the way animals use it for navigation. But I didn't fancy teaching them to add horrific screeches to their Batman impressions. I'd all but given up on finding anything useful when I stumbled across an article on scientific explanations for the paranormal based on sounds that existed outside of normal hearing range. The article was fascinating. A scientist called Gavro had noticed that certain areas of a particular laboratory made anyone who worked there feel uneasy and scared. Some went as far as to say they'd seen ghosts and shadowy figures in that part of the lab. Few would dare work there, and fewer would dare twice. Being a man of science, the researcher rejected any supernatural claims and set up monitoring equipment around the area to investigate. What he found was that the area was a hotbed of subsonic sound waves. There were all kinds of research equipment in and around the lab, like centrifuges and auto-stirrers and incubators, all creating sound waves inaudible to the human ear, but which created a feeling of dread and terror in anyone that was subjected to them. Paranormal research critics were quick to point out that whilst subsonic waves might account for the feelings of dread, they asked how this explains the visions of ghostly and shadowy figures that were also reported in the lab. Gavro postulated that the waves caused the front of the eyes to vibrate, and that this could distort sight, inducing visions of horrific shadow men and other tormentors. I even read that Gavro was planning to expand his research into whether this might explain other ghost reports. For instance, the huge increase in ghost sightings during building projects like extensions to the London Underground tube lines, often blamed on disturbed graves and inappropriate plans. It may be nothing more than the subsonic waves caused by the digging machines. Yes, this was perfect. I couldn't believe my luck. It was such a simple experiment to set up in a classroom, and even the most hardened little thug gets quickly silenced when they think ghosts are in the room. Then once they're thoroughly terrified, bam! Science. I was grinning from ear to ear at this point. I couldn't wait. For the first time ever, I was actually looking forward to the next lesson. I was so naive. I should have looked deeper. The irony is that everything that unfolded from here on out is down to the fact that I, teacher of the worst class in the country, didn't do my homework. It would have been hilarious were it not for the tragedy of what was to come. I finished my lesson plan and went to bed, getting the last good night's sleep I'd ever enjoy. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. The morning came, and I still had a confident spring in my step. I even treated myself to a nice coffee on the way to work. I started doing the criminal thing that you do when you think you've had a good idea and let the fantasy run away with itself. After all, I'd just figured out how I was going to control that class. My head of year didn't know how to do that. Maybe this would lead to a promotion. Maybe I'd be next in line for the head of department. Maybe I could include it in the book I was going to write about controlling classrooms. Maybe I'd be invited on to TV to explain how I'd turned this obnoxious class around. I knew I was getting way ahead of myself, but hey, it was a daydream for the commute. Where was the harm in letting it run a little? I got to my classroom and started setting up the equipment. They were going to be my first class of the day, so I wouldn't have to wait forever, which was lucky because at this point, I could barely contain myself. The equipment was very simple. There was going to be a basic speaker at the front of the classroom, which would be the focal point of the display. And in the back corners, I set up a couple of metal plates that were held in front of electromagnets. They were all going to be set to the same subsonic frequency that Gavreau had used, and I hoped that the acoustics of the room would amplify the effect. The class piled in and took their places. They were already starting to play up, but a couple of them were disquieted by the calm, confident look on my face. There wasn't much that gave any of their teachers cause for that kind of collected facial expression in their classes. Most had a look of barely concealed fear and trepidation, so to see me looking like a Hindu cow shook their confidence. I had to capitalize on this brief period of crumbled bravado before they collected themselves. "Sound!" I bellowed. "What is it?" My question was met with stony silence, as most of my attempts to engage with them were. Sound is a form of wave energy that, for the most part, allows us to hear things. I subtly turned on the speakers to their subsonic frequency. It was at a low amplitude, so no one perceived anything yet. However, scientists are still discovering new ways that the body interacts with energy in all its forms. Every day we find new mechanisms by which the body is sensitive to energy. Every day, uncover a new way to explain the unexplainable by using rigorous scientific methods to observe, predict, experiment, and analyze. I tweaked the intensity up a few notches and saw a few of their bored expressions shift to one much less complacent. I was loving this, truly loving this. I almost didn't know whether I was getting an adrenaline rush from finally controlling this unruly class, or whether the sound waves were starting to get to me too. There was a bubbling panic growing in my chest, but I was sure that was just down to the excitement of the position. Even if I was also being affected, at least I knew that I was in control. And if you kids really apply yourself, really buckle down and stop giving me crap, then maybe you'd be able to use science to achieve something. I paused and scanned over their increasingly distressed faces to ensure that I really had them before I went to the grand finale. Really special. I cranked the intensity of the sound wave up to full. I saw an instant shift in their demeanor. It was beautiful. A few started crying. Some hid their eyes. Some were just frantically looking around, wondering if they were the only ones, and quickly seeing that they weren't. I almost started scaring myself. I looked across their terrified faces, watched them start scrambling and pleading with me and each other and God and anyone to make it stop. This started to feel like revenge rather than science. Every crappy lesson, every fight, every interruption, every curse, every punch, and every missed piece of homework was all avenged as I watched the class descend into pure terrified panic. Then there was a shift. I don't know why I'd been slower to respond, but all of a sudden, the sound waves got to me too. Then I saw what they were seeing. I understood their fear. Shadowy figures swooped and darted around the peripheries of my vision. The corners of my eyes were dancing with barely seen terrors. However, when one of the shadows appeared to dash right across the classroom, I realized I'd gone too far. And this was terrifying even for me, and I knew none of it was real. This needed to stop now, before it went any further. I killed the power to all speakers. Instantly, the room was back to normal. No figures, no shadows, nothing clawing at the extremities of your vision. Just another classroom full of clearly unsettled children. I regained control of myself and calmly explained to the class exactly what had happened. We went into detail about sound waves, energy transfer, the retina, the eye's lens, the whole lot. I knew I'd way overstepped the mark, and I didn't want to send a single child out until I was sure they knew that it was all an illusion, that there were no ghosts, no evil shadows, just a scientific trick of the mind. Most of the class had recovered by the time they needed to leave for their next lesson. A couple were still shaken, but I was satisfied that all they needed was a bit of a sit-down. I'd certainly knocked them down a peg or two. Amazingly, Jake even looked me right in the eye and said, "Nice one," before moving on. I was in a better mood than I'd been all year. I told the head of year, and he let out a laugh so loud and appreciative that I was sure that half the surrounding classes had heard.
God, I wish I'd been there.
He then put his stern professional face on and said,
"But you really should run these kinds of things past me first. If one of the parents complains."
He trailed off, before looking at me again and letting his stern facade break into another wide, appreciative grin. I stayed on cloud 9 until later that evening. Everything was fine until the sun went down, and it started getting a bit dark. I could have sworn I saw another shadow dart into hiding. What the hell was that? Out of the corner of my eye. The first time it happened, I was still full of bravado, thinking, I know what caused that. The pneumatic drill must be vibrating my windows just right. At that point, I actually believed myself. However, as the light continued to fade, the twilight carried on playing tricks on me. I kept seeing dancing in the shadows long after the road crews had gone home. I tried just getting an early night, but I couldn't. As soon as I felt myself drifting off, I'd see more movement in the shadows. Hard as I tried, I kept seeing the darkness moving. They kept darting around. They darted towards, away, and around me. Sometimes they looked like they were just standing there. Other times, they looked like they were ready to jump on me. My imagination was driving me wild. I couldn't take it anymore, so I bolted out, turned on all the lights, and went on the internet. Unable to think of anything more constructive, I researched a bit more about Gavro's findings. Why didn't I do this before? Gavro's scientific studies had tapered away rather rapidly after his subsonic discovery. From what I could see, they were replaced with increasingly erratic and less reliable conjecture about the nature and power of the sounds and the shadows. Most of his academic companions deserted him as he got more and more unhinged. I remembered the power I felt manipulating the class, and I remembered having to tell myself that it was just an illusion. What if Gavro lost that grip on reality? What if he kept pushing it until he forgot the science and believed his own pranks? I was hardly comforted when I found out that his final conclusion from his last published research paper, widely discredited by all who found it, was that the sound didn't make you see ghosts. The sound let you see ghosts that were already there, and they didn't appreciate being seen. I couldn't sleep a wink. It didn't look like any of the class did either when I saw them the next day. Saggy-eyed, drowsy, and yawning. I asked them what was up.
I kept seeing the shadows, sir,
said one, and many murmured in agreement. Worse, though, was that one student hadn't turned up at all. Jake was absent. Not especially unusual. A lot of the students played truant when given a chance, but something didn't sit right. I asked if any of the students had heard anything from him. One girl timidly replied,
"He texted me last night, sir. Said he couldn't sleep. Said he needed to find what was making the sound so he could turn it off."
I just hoped he found it. I just hoped he got some sleep. I hoped we all would. For good measure, I spent the remainder of the lesson going over the science behind my little illusion again, in order to try and allay their uncertainties and fears. It was almost funny. This lesson went even better than the previous one, as every student was held in a rapt state of attention. The whole class clung on to my every word. They took notes, drew diagrams, asked deep and pertinent questions on and around the subject, and they even completed all their group work with nary a ripple of disruption. I understood, of course, exactly what they were doing. They were trying their very best to understand what had happened to them yesterday, so that they could really try and put it behind them. I'd always considered scientists to be as brave pioneers branching out into the unknown, but looking across my students' steadily brightening faces, I saw how science could just as easily be a comforting blanket, a rational barrier against the demons of the unknown. By the end of the class, the horror of the previous day seemed to have well and truly faded and was replaced by a joking camaraderie. Kids who would normally have been at each other's throats in group sessions were working without issue. They even seemed positively friendly with each other, in a way only a group who've experienced a shared hardship could be. It was a fantastic sight. My earlier doubts about whether I'd gone too far were still there, but to look at them working productively and peacefully with each other, it was difficult to be too concerned. Jake still played on my mind, though. I was sure he was fine. He made truancy into an art form. But his texts about needing to turn off the sound in the middle of the night still made me nervous. Yet the lesson had one last shot for my nerves in store. It concluded without issue, and concerns for Jake aside, I genuinely thought maybe I'd turned a corner with this class. I needed to be far more careful if I was going to use it with any other classes in the future, though. I had been completely unprepared for the intensity of the visions and the feelings of sheer terror. But it didn't seem to be anything that a bit of personal experimentation with the equipment couldn't refine in order to get the right level, and just looking at the quality of the work that the class had just produced, it was going to be easy to get the head of science to sign off on the experiment for further use. I was still running through these thoughts and contemplating what modifications to try next, when, as the students were leaving, one girl asked to see me for a minute. In the now empty classroom, she stood, staring intently at her shoes and refusing to look me in the eye. "What is it, Amy?" She shifted her weight uncomfortably.
Sir,
She was having trouble formulating her question.
were the speakers on just then?
When?
During the lesson.
No. Why? The color drained from her face as she weakly answered.
Oh, nothing.
She scuttled out of the room, clearly needing to be anywhere but in that classroom. I wanted to call after her, chase her even, in order to clarify what she meant, but I was distracted by something skittering across the room, out of the corner of my eye. I didn't get a clear look, and by the time I'd spun around to try and see, it had gone. I turned back to the corridor to shout after Amy, but she too had disappeared. Just as suddenly, her question disturbed me, and my mind returned to Jake. I used the morning break to contact the office to see if there was any word on him. Jake Tandy, Class G2. Any word from him or his parents as to where he is today? I asked the office girl in charge of monitoring attendance. She was about to answer when a gray smudge darted across the doorway to my right and pulled my attention away. I was still staring intently at the door when, out of nowhere, Richard, my head of year, stuck his head into the room and asked to borrow me for a moment. He ushered me into his office and closed the door.
Jake Tandy was reported missing as of 9:30 a.m. this morning.
What? By whom?
His mother. When she noticed he wasn't in bed this morning, she called round a couple of his girlfriends' houses to find out if he'd snuck out there in the night. None of them had seen him. When she called to find out if he was in school, we told her he wasn't here. Her next call, obviously, was to the police. Now, one of our students is officially missing.
My mind was overwhelmed with questions. The playful grin that was on his face when I first told him of the demonstration was well and truly gone, replaced by an unshifting expression of grave concern.
The police found Jake's phone in his room, and the final message he sent details him going to find the source of the sound. They want to know what that means.
Of course. Do they need a formal statement?
I don't know. You can ask them yourself. They want to talk to you as soon as we're finished. Now, listen, and listen carefully. I'm sure I don't have to tell you how serious the consequences of this could be if Jake doesn't turn up quickly. This experiment you ran, please tell me you first ran some basic safety tests or ran a risk assessment.
How could I have been so stupid? I didn't so much as do a test run before the lesson, let alone do something as sensible as documenting a full risk assessment or investigate whether infrasound fell under the Department of Education regulations. My complete, unforgivable incompetence must have been written across my face, because before I could answer, Richard interrupted.
You friggin' fool!
I had to focus all my strength to not burst into tears right there in his office. My eyes were damp, but I maintained composure.
Answer me this, and you had better answer truthfully.
Richard continued.
Do you have any cause for any form of concern for any of your other students?
Amy, I uttered quietly, still staring at my hands to avoid revealing my increasingly watery eyes.
What?
I raised my head to meet his accusatory gaze. Amy Sunderland. She approached me after the class today to ask. My heart stopped. Standing over each of Richard's shoulders were two towering, shadowy figures. Through the blur of my tears, I couldn't make out even basic features. All I could see were that they were definitely human-shaped. I was frozen with dread, and a feeling of deep panic started welling up in my stomach.
What? What did Amy ask?
I rubbed my eyes dry in order to answer him. Once I'd cleared my sight, the figures were gone. I looked around, but there was nothing and no one else there anymore.
Answer me, damn it!
She asked if I had the speakers on during today's lesson. I tried to ask her, but she wouldn't answer me.
And did you have them on?
No!
Right. Tell the police that. Tell them everything. I'll send them in.
Richard stood up to leave and walked towards the door. I felt him stand behind me and place a reassuring hand on my shoulder. I couldn't believe how irresponsible I'd been, how reckless. I'd been so caught up in my own ambition that I hadn't taken even basic precautions, and now I was paying for it. I just hoped that Jake was all right. I knew Richard was furious with me, but feeling his protective hand on my shoulder meant that maybe there was a way to fix it all. I heard Richard outside, telling the officers to head in. Wait. Richard was outside? Then whose hand was... I spun around to see an empty room. I desperately tried to contain the panic coursing through my veins. What was happening to me? It was just an illusion. Two officers entered the room.
Good morning. Thank you for talking with us. Now, tell me about infrasound.
Through the tension, I almost laughed. Where to begin? I'd rarely seen police officers as young as the two opposite me. They lacked the authoritative confidence one would normally expect during questioning in a missing child case. The questions were meandering and unfocused, as though the officers really didn't know what they were actually trying to achieve or elicit from me. My guess was that they were rookies who had been lumped in with the dull task of closing off a dead-end lead. When a child goes missing, every lead needs to be chased, if only to protect the police force against accusations of neglect if the search failed. But Jake was a troubled kid, and I know he had been caught dealing weed to other pupils. I imagine that the officer in charge of the case had a stack of leads that provided far more plausible explanations as to why a kid with links to local low-level drug dealers might mysteriously go missing in the night. He wasn't going to waste his best officers chasing down a science teacher using strange noises to fill a room with ghosts. These officers were here on a glorified administrative mission, and I could see resentment in their eyes. But for their lack of experience and motivation, they were diligent nonetheless. They wanted more details about the nature of infrasound and what it could mean in the context of Jake's text, so we discussed it in some detail. I delivered a mini-science lesson about the nature of low-frequency wave energy, natural resonance, and how the retina could be fooled into seeing things that weren't there. Describing it was almost therapeutic given everything that had just happened. As I felt my grasp on reality slipping, it was good to go over the simple, rational explanations to help me regain my grip. I answered all of their questions about Jake. Apparently all they found on Jake's home computer were a few articles about shadow people and ghosts, as well as a few research papers on unrelated medical procedures. They wanted to know if the two could be linked, but I explained that Jake's mom was a nurse in the nearby hospital, so if anyone was searching for methicillin-resistant staph or aureus treatments, or subcranial hematomas, or phacoemulsification techniques, then it was probably her. Shadow people and U-porn, though, that sounded more like Jake. Eventually, they had no further questions. Though their theories were obviously not something I was supposed to be privy to, their relative greenness as officers meant that they let slip more than they should have when exchanging tidbits. From what I could gather, they thought that my experiment had probably spooked him, leading to a sleepless night. In his insomnia, he probably tried to sneak out to visit a girlfriend, but had fallen afoul of one of his less amiable contacts en route. There was an implication that even at 15, Jake already owed some serious people money. The officers had what they needed to close this lead. I was thanked for my help, and they left. Richard seemed visibly relieved when I explained to him everything we'd talked about. He'd clearly been driving himself crazy thinking that the cops were investigating a case of neglect at the school, and that he was going to be facing legal action over inappropriate experiments being conducted in the classroom. However, although the panic had faded, his anger had not.
Clean up this mess, now! Talk to all of your students from yesterday. Find out if any of them are still having problems and fix it. Make sure they know there's nothing to worry about. If I get so much as a report of a broken night's sleep from one of their parents, then you're finished.
I sent messages out to all the students and asked them to come see me as soon as possible, since Richard had agreed to cover the rest of my day's classes. I interviewed them one by one, asking them what they'd seen since the experiment. Most told stories about occasional glimpses of something in the dark. One told me that he was so scared that he hadn't been able to do any of his homework. Nice try, I thought, but I kept my solemn face on. However, most had been able to nod off eventually, and few complained of anything further stretching into the daytime. In fact, when really pushed, most seemed to agree that anything they had seen was just their imagination going into overdrive. Secretly, I had my doubts as to how many of their visions truly were imaginary, but the calmer they were, the less they were affected, and if they truly did see fewer shadows, the less they believed. I was just going to let them carry on and watch the problem solve itself. The end of the day came, and I looked over the register of the class to see who I'd managed to talk to. I'd ticked off everyone, bar 2. Jake and Amy. I hadn't seen Amy since she approached me after the lesson. I hurried to the administration department to report it, but Amy had apparently been picked up by her father earlier that morning, claiming to be suffering from a massive headache. I breathed a sigh of relief. I could talk to her tomorrow, and hopefully another night's sleep would put the whole thing to bed. With Amy safe at home, the day over, and Jake still nowhere to be found, I went back to my place. I poured myself a whiskey and stood at my window, watching the sun go down over the city horizon. It was normally a beautiful sight. This view was one of the principal reasons I paid so much for this apartment, but today it held no such pleasure. The sun got lower, and I watched as the tall building's shadows elongated into the evening. There was something about the way that the shadows were creeping across the streets and over the hedges and walls towards my windows that sent my heart racing. Of course, it was just the angle of the sun, but for all the panic of the last 2 days, it was difficult not to feel an almost predatory aspect to their approach. The way the shadows snaked through the trees and poured through my windows, the way the black imprints of the lamp posts and power lines created long, grasping fingers that crawled up into my room. Soon, the whole city seemed to be cloaked in a dusky twilight, and every shadow seemed to writhe and pulsate. The wind blew the trees, and the shadows swayed on my walls like a cobra waiting to strike. I downed the whiskey and threw on all the lights for comfort, but there was no comfort to be had. The harsh, bright lights just turned my apartment into a patchwork of shadows. Behind the couch, behind the TV, over the cupboards, and anywhere that bright, central light couldn't reach was suddenly turned into a pool of darkness. A darkness that stared and watched and waited and mocked. A darkness that demanded to hold my gaze just so that it could gaze right back at me. I poured another whiskey. Brought it to my mouth, then took a deep swig when, through the distorting lens of the bottom of the glass, I saw a blurry, dark figure standing in front of me. I was paralyzed. The whiskey slopped against my teeth and burned my tongue, but I didn't dare swallow. I didn't dare move. I just watched as the shadowy figure towered, motionless, challenging me to react. An eternity passed in between the poundings of my heart. The vapor of the whiskey almost tickled my nostrils, and in that moment of lapsed concentration, the shadowy figure charged at me. I screamed and flailed, sending my glass shattering against the nearby wall. But then, nothing. In the instant that our gaze had broken, the figure was gone. I stood, panting and breathless, my heart beating so loud I couldn't hear. I was sweating burnt adrenaline and shaking so hard my teeth were chattering. I brought my hand up, and grabbing a handful of hair, I collapsed backwards against the cupboard and slid to the floor. If not believing was the key to not seeing these things, then I was doomed forever. Gavreau was right. He must have been. These ghosts were already here. I just let them out. But what did they want? I don't know how long I sat there for. It felt like hours. Soon, though, I found my composure and got the courage to stand up. I poured another whiskey, but the shadows were still there. In every alcove and nook and cranny of furniture, there was another drape of shadow waiting to pounce. I had to get out of that place right then. I wandered the streets until I found an internet cafe that was open until late. Better still, they too had whiskey. I wasn't really paying attention to what I was doing, just blind, meaningless surfing of anything that came to mind. Given the evening I'd had, pictures of kittens were a central theme. However, through my aimless Googling, one particular results page came up. Result 1, as usual, was a wiki article. I figured there was no harm in reading it in case anyone ever asked, so I clicked it. I felt my stomach lurch and my heart sink. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911. I knew where Jake was. I just hoped I was in time. By the time I got to the hospital, the police were already there. I should have known there was no way that the hospital staff would let me see Jake, but the police were very eager to talk to me. My tongue couldn't keep pace with my brain, and the gargled mess of questions that I barraged the police with were barely coherent. An officer I hadn't met before raised an authoritative hand to silence me.
Please, sir, follow me. We have some further questions.
Is he all right?
Sir, if you'd just please follow me.
I was ushered into a small room and sat down on a squeaky and uncomfortable chair. The officer took his place behind the desk. What the hell was this room? What kind of a hospital had an interrogation room? The officer was not one I recognized. He certainly wasn't with the two who questioned me earlier. He was older, and he was also harder, more experienced. His stony face revealed nothing of his intentions or how much he knew. And I imagined that, unlike the two rookies who questioned me earlier, I wasn't going to find out one damn thing he didn't want me to know.
You're Jake's teacher, correct? The one who placed the call.
Yes, that's me. Is Jake all right?
No, but he will survive.
I couldn't tell whether to be relieved or not. The officer's poker face refused to let slip anything that could calm my fears for Jake. But he's alive.
Yes. Now tell me, how did you know where to find Jake? How did you know he'd be here?
It was a guess. Something your officers asked me about earlier. He held my gaze, revealing nothing, and taunting me into carrying on. Your officers, that is, the infrasound.
Yes, this ghost noise of yours.
He interrupted with the tone of a man sick of entertaining the idea that there was anything at play here other than an off-the-rails kid in trouble. However, there was the faintest flicker of doubt in his eyes, as though he'd seen something he couldn't reconcile with his foregone conclusion. The infrasound interferes with your eye's lens. It makes you see things that aren't there. Terrible things. Jake's text about turning off the noise made me think that he was still seeing them, and that maybe that had something to do with his disappearance. The officer remained stoic. I had no doubt that this was a man who was well versed in allowing criminals to hang themselves with their words, with nothing other than the blunt force of silence. Then, this morning, your officers were talking to me about things that were in Jake's search history. Most of it was unsurprising given the nature of the vision and the nature of him being a 15-year-old boy. Then they mentioned some medical terms he'd also been searching for. At first, I figured they were from his mom, as she's a nurse, and I didn't see any connection between them and the infrasonic visions. Still, nothing. The officer was going to wait until I'd told him everything before he played his hand in return. Out of curiosity, I Googled the ones I hadn't heard of. The faintest twitch disturbed the officer's rigid gaze. Phacoemulsification is a form of eye surgery based on using ultrasound to break up cataracts. I saw Jake's logic straight away. I'd screwed up his eyes using infrasound, so maybe he thought he could fix them using ultrasound. I knew with his mom working here, he'd know the layout and maybe even have the means to gain access to the relevant wards. That was when I called you. Now, please, tell me what happened to Jake. At this point, my mind was almost at breaking point. I needed to know what was happening. The officer took his time to consider revealing what he knew. Eventually, he leaned in close and said softly,
Jake Tandy blinded himself using the ultrasonic equipment in the ophthalmology lab. I don't know whether that was what he intended to do, but that was the result.
My jaw dropped.
He directed 2 focused waves of ultrasound into each eye and destroyed the lens and retina. Nurses found him curled up by the still-running machine. When they tried to approach him, he lashed out at the sound of their footsteps and screamed to be left alone. He calmed down as soon as he heard their voices and sobbed apologies for his outburst, saying, I thought you were them. The nurses said he kept repeating, they're gone. I can't see them. They're gone. I can't see them, as they took him to intensive care. He was smiling.
I was gonna be sick. I'm so sorry, Jake. I truly am. I never intended for any of this. Please believe me. Willie, Is he? I stammered.
As I said, he will live, but there's no way to save his sight, and he'll need extensive therapy.
At this point, the officer leaned in closer. He had the same look of steely authority on his face that Richard had when he originally questioned me about the other affected pupils. He was mentally searching for something, anything that could be used to pin this on me. But he was falling short. There were no regulations in place regarding infrasound, even in a concentrated experiment, so they couldn't even charge me with professional misconduct, let alone assault. I was free to go. Instead, he simply held my gaze and asked in a bullying tone,
You got anything else to tell me?
There were hundreds of things I wanted to tell him. Jake was right. I wanted to tell him we were both being stalked by the shadowy beings. I wanted to tell him that my apartment was an inhospitable orgy of demonic chaos. But I didn't. At this point, I must have looked insane enough without the truth making things worse. I simply whimpered. No. Like a kicked puppy.
In that case, you're free to go, but look,
he said, softening his tone momentarily.
If you think of anything else, here's my number.
I was walking out of the hospital towards the parking lot when a thought hit me like a brick. Amy! I'd failed Jake, and for that, I could never forgive myself. But I could still save Amy. Oh, please let me be in time to save Amy. I immediately called the detective. I'm still at the hospital. Can you meet me downstairs? I've thought of someone you need to speak to. When the officer arrived in the cold, comforting, well-lit hospital reception area, I told him, You need to send someone to check on Amy Sunderland. She went home complaining of headaches, and she also complained of seeing the same shadows long after the experiment finished.
I don't see any reports of missing Amy Sunderland.
She's not missing. She's at home. Her father collected her from school today.
Listen, I appreciate your concern, but I can't send officers over to someone's house to see if a 15-year-old girl has recovered from a headache.
Just please send someone. I don't know her address, but her parents are Lydia and Jim Sunderland. I think she might be in danger. She reported exactly the same symptoms as Jake, just a few hours behind. If she's following the same path, then we might not have long to prevent the same thing happening again. Please! The officer fell silent. This wasn't the same authoritative silence he'd used to intimidate me during questioning. This was the genuine sound of indecision. He'd had a difficult night. Just because Jake had been found didn't mean his case was closed, and the officer still had the task of discovering how a 15-year-old boy had been able to get access to hospital equipment and blind himself. He took his time weighing up whether he could justify sending officers to check on the girl given the crime scene at the hospital. My face must have swayed him. After all, the only reason Jake was found was because of my hunch, so he figured it was better to be safe than sorry. He pulled the walkie-talkie to his mouth.
Send a car around to check on the house of Lydia and James Sunderland.
Could you repeat the names?
Crackled a male voice on the other end.
Lydia and Jim Sunderland, parents of Amy Sunderland.
Sir, I don't understand. You want another car sent there?
Came the voice, still seeking clarification.
What do you mean another?
2 cars already visited this evening, sir, accompanying the ambulance, in order to assess the scene and question the parents.
The professional facade the man had put on this morning was dying in front of me. His ashen face looked ready to crumble as the implications sunk in. He looked like he wanted to shoo me away in case I overheard important information, but he didn't.
What happened?
He quizzed the still nonplussed radio operator.
Sorry, sir. I thought you knew.
They don't allow phones in the hospital. I haven't been updated on anything for an hour or so. Tell me.
Sir, Amy Sunderland was found dead in her room this evening. She bled to death after clawing her eyes out. Her parents left her sleeping off a migraine to go to the movies and found her when they returned.
My world broke. I'd failed Jake. I'd failed Amy. I'd failed everyone. I don't even know what happened next. In a mindless daze, I drifted home. It was going on midnight by this point, barely 48 hours since I'd found that damned article. 2 days ago, I'd been a self-pitying teacher with a tough class and a lack of balls. I now had the weight of Jake's sight and Amy's life crushing me. Through the aimless glaze, there was my vision. I stumbled home. I didn't care. The shadows in the streets, in the bushes, in the alleys, and between the cars seemed thicker, almost solid, tangible. They seemed to reach for me, grasp me, touch me, grab me. I even felt fingers on my bare skin at times. Chilled scratches ran up my arms and down my neck. But I didn't care. When I got to my door, I opened it and looked into my shadowy dwelling. The darkness here was alive now. I could feel it. At this point, I don't think even turning the lights on could have dissipated the sea of writhing blackness that engulfed my home. It pulsed and swayed and seemed to breathe as I stared into it. It wasn't just figures anymore. It was dozens of them, all dancing and mocking and taunting and begging me to join them. Inky black tendrils snaked out of the doorway and over the hallway walls like the branches of some foul tree, growing and producing some fouler fruit. Snakes of writhing black snuck across the floor towards my feet. Whatever I'd brought forth with my little science lesson wasn't going away and wasn't going to let me go. It still had another 30 kids to claim from my mistake. I could think of nothing else to save them. So as the horrific fingers of whatever lived in those shadows continued to climb up my legs, I simply walked in and closed the door behind me. I didn't care. I'm sorry.
Months later, I can remember all of them, down to the slightest idiosyncrasies and quirks. They were my friends, and they're gone now. There's a hole in my life where they were. Sometimes I'll remember something they said or did. It'll hit me like a ton of bricks. They're gone now. They never existed. I'm sorry for being maudlin and bringing everyone down, but I think this is the only way I can really introduce my story and explain why I feel like this. Why I have to type this out. I think that writing this is the only way I can learn to accept that. I'll try to keep these downer tendencies to myself as I'm writing all this down, but I can't make any promises. I know that being the third wheel in a group can be a terrible thing, but I can think of something worse. Being the fifth wheel. If you're the third wheel, that makes your group a semi-functional tricycle. If you're the fifth wheel, you're left as some obscure car from the 50s that no one remembers or cares about. Imagine not being able to follow the in-jokes and shared history of one couple and multiply that by 2. Getting stuck as the fifth wheel is twice as bad. And that was the frame of mind I had as we all piled into Ian's car to go to Gila National Forest for our hike. I know that's a weird opening to give to after my depressing opening. I want you all to have an idea of my mindset. I'm not quite sure I know how to describe all this, but I do know I need to tell someone. I need someone else to know what happened and help me come to terms with it. I think the only way I'll be able to explain this would be to help you see from my perspective as much as possible. So there we were, driving down to Gila for a hike, with me feeling like the fifth wheel wedged between 2 of Ian's friends who I didn't know. 3 of us cramped in the back seat while Ian and his girlfriend were up front. I look back at the unnecessary bit of moping back in August 2016 as one of the few last moments of normalcy I would have in my life. I tried to make the best of the situation. I really did, but Ian was always the more social of us. My mom would tell us that Ian could make anyone his friend, and that once I had a friend, then I kept them. It was one of those parental platitudes that was given to reassure a socially awkward child that there was nothing wrong. Unfortunately, it would take me almost 19 years to learn that it wasn't true. Instead of taking my therapist's diagnosis of social anxiety disorder following a breakdown after an office get-together as a means of seeking treatment, I used it as an excuse to cloister myself off from the rest of the world. I stayed in my apartment when I wasn't working and told myself that I was just doing what was best for me. Of course, Ian decided that wasn't healthy and convinced me to go on a weekend-long hike with him. It wasn't until I showed up at his house at 6 in the morning on Friday, after taking the day off of work, that I saw that he had invited others along. I think he saw it as a means of getting me help, of breaking me out of my shell. Unfortunately, though, with Ian's extroverted nature, he didn't realize that I like being in my shell. It's comfortable. A turtle doesn't like being broken out of its shell. After a brief introduction, where I caught no one's name except for those who I already knew, my brother and his girlfriend Jessica, due to the morning grogginess and the rushed introduction, we packed up in the car and left for our hike. It took 3 hours of mostly awkward silence for us to reach our destination. Ian tried to make conversation, but my short responses and the others' sleepiness killed them off fairly quickly. We found the parking lot near the Gila cliff dwellings. As we unpacked our gear, we took a moment to bask in the beautiful sight that sat perched above us. It's hard to believe that someone could carve an entire town of the face of a cliff. But 700 years ago, people managed to do just that. Given that the parking lot was empty except for us, we would find out why later. And I was in need of some social lubrication. We split a 6-pack of beer and took in the majesty. As we finished our beers, got everything prepared, and used the restrooms, Ian explained what path we would be taking in detail. What we didn't know, and what my brother had failed to tell us, was that the West Fork Trail had been closed all summer due to the flooding. To be honest, the path wasn't that dangerous. They had just opted not to clear it due to the recent flooding, so it was a bit more of a rugged hike. While it wasn't perilous, it did keep us from encountering other hikers which would cause us a lot of problems when we actually needed help. Ian figured that we could make about 2 or 3 miles per hour, and we'd be able to complete the Gila Loop, which is about 30 miles long, with enough time to get back on Sunday and be ready for our respective jobs on Monday, with no one any the wiser that we had backpacked a close section of the national park. As his explanation was a bit heavy on names and locations, some of which I can't really recall, I'll opt to include a picture rather than spend a page writing out everything. For the sake of simplicity, this is the path we were planning to take. In addition, I'll include a more detailed map of the entire area so you can orient yourself if you want to trace the trail we took. If you plan on following along with the path, as I tell you about the experience, all I can say is good luck. Even as I stare at it now, I feel just as lost now as I was then. I was just going along with the group and trying to keep a positive mind about everything. I wanted to try to do a better job of getting to know Ian and Jessica's friends. I think my circumstances had finally begun to set in, and I'd been living in a quiet apartment in New Mexico for over a year. I had no friends. I would go to work, go home without doing anything else. Sometimes I would spend an entire weekend without saying a single word to anyone or seeing another person. I know that if I didn't change something quick, that solitude would become the norm. That frightened me. Our first day was relatively quiet. We spent a majority of the time taking in the sights, soaking in the sun, and breathing in the fresh air. The hike felt like we were constantly moving upward. As I was unaccustomed to hiking, I frequently fell behind, but never completely lost sight of my brother's friends. While we took a break under the shade of a tree whose bark looked like the dried scales of some long-dead alligator, I tried to make small talk with everyone. I fell into a quick conversation with Ian and Jessica about their work and what they'd been up to lately. When it came time to talk to the other two, I only managed to get the conversation going for a few sentences before it shriveled up and died. I remembered assuring myself that it would be easier when we stopped for the night. We rested for a while before continuing our ascent up the mesa. This is where everyone realized how truly out of my element I was here. The path up the mesa was agonizing for me. It seemed to never stop climbing up, and there was almost no shade to keep the sun from beating down on us. I was sweating buckets, panting, wheezing whenever they stopped to wait for me to catch up. I tried to pretend that I didn't notice their exasperated whispers or side glances, but it was easier said than done. They seemed like the outdoorsy type that had been doing this sort of thing for years. By the time our path started to level out, I was ready to turn around and leave. It wasn't until I reached the top and looked over everything that I realized how foolish of an idea that was. Even if I was able to convince Ian to give me the keys and let me walk back to the car and go home, I had no idea where I was or what trail markers we'd been using. I imagined splitting off from the group and tromping through the poison ivy, bumbling into a rapey gang of banjo-playing hillfolk, or getting lost in the dark and wandering circles until exhaustion and exposure took me. Even if I did manage to hike back to the parking lot, where was I going to go? Would I go back home to an empty apartment, eat a Hot Pocket, feel sorry for myself again? I decided to tough it out and continue hiking. We made camp at a dry section of the Indian Creek. After having hiked a decent amount, Ian was confident that we would make it back by Sunday, and that the next few days were going to be less intensive. We had some food and stowed the rest in a bear bag, ways away from the camp. We were passing a bottle of whiskey around in front of the campfire we had built when the conversation shifted to the most awkward moments everyone has experienced. Ian retold his story about the first time he met Jessica at the club, where he was too drunk for his own good and ended up puking in her purse. Jessica bristled at the memory and jokingly called Ian an asshole for it. Each person shared their stories about a bumbling first kiss when their braces got hooked together, locking themselves out of their dorm room in their underwear, their cringe-inducing high school edgelord personality, and caring for their drunken boyfriend who puked into their favorite bag. When the bottle came to me, it was my turn to tell a story. I instantly knew what my most embarrassing story was the moment we started the conversation. I didn't tell them about the door, though. Instead, I made up a story, ripping my pants in front of a group of people during a work interview, and I'd probably rip straight from a 90s sitcom. They laughed with me, and I felt like a piece of shit. And they had bothered to reveal their most embarrassing moments and were commiserating in their shared experiences. And here I was, too afraid to tell the truth, to tell them about the door. The conversation continued a bit afterwards as we killed the bottle. When it was dead, we all went to bed, still pretty drunk after dousing the campfire. I woke up in the middle of the night, desperately needing to use the bathroom. I was still a bit fuzzy from the Boyot whiskey. I tromped out into the woods to do my business. It wasn't until I was almost done that Nadia's voice cut through the blackness. She asked me if I had a lighter. Since I hadn't heard her approach, the sound of her voice made me jump. It would have scared the piss out of me if I'd not just gone to the bathroom. I mumbled something about having a lighter back around the camp. And she told me she had dropped hers and asked if I'd help her look for it, but I was too out of it to be any good to anyone, so I told her we'd look for it later. I vaguely remember her mumbling a protest as I stumbled back to my sleeping row. It wasn't until I woke up the next morning that I realized how stupid I had been. Apparently, they had heard yowling in the surrounding woods all last night. They thought the sound could have possibly belonged to the Mexican gray wolf, but no one was sure. Ian knew that they had inhabited the area, but were very uncommon. I paled at the thought of being mauled by a wolf while out peeing in the middle of the woods. I decided next time I would wake up Ian before going out into the woods to answer nature's call. We packed up a while later, after a light breakfast, and continued on our hike. The second day was a little better. The overbearing sun I suffered under previously was hidden behind heavy clouds. We crossed a number of rivers as we followed the 157-729 junction. We went along the Little Bear Canyon as we headed toward TJ Corral, which was towards the end of the hiking loop. As the path hadn't been cleared yet, we frequently had to dodge patches of poison ivy and stinging nettles. I fared much better on this hike, despite nursing a slight hangover. I felt like I was doing a much better job of getting around with my pack of clunky boots my brother had loaned me. We made camp around midday and purified some water from a nearby river, boiling and adding iodine tablets to them. As the last section of our hike didn't really have many opportunities for drinkable water. I think that maybe our encounter last night with the yipping and yowling wolves had added a bit of seriousness to the hike, as there wasn't as much joking around or conversations this night. We talked a little bit, but mainly just had something small to eat while we stared into the campfire. Ian and Jessica were the first to call it a night. I stayed up with the others for a bit, but we were mostly silent. The other two slowly went off a bit later, and I decided to enjoy the warmth a bit longer before getting ready for bed. Just as I'd finished dousing the fire, I remember Gary coming up to me and asking me for the map. He told me he wanted to plan the rest of our trip, and that there was a spring nearby that we should really visit, and it wasn't too far out of the way. I grabbed the map from Ian's pack and gave it to him before turning in. I woke up the next morning to the sound of Ian rustling around his bag. He sounded angrier the longer I searched. He knocked mess kits into each other as he peered deep into the bag for something he was missing. Frustrated that he wasn't finding the item he was looking for, he turned the bag upside down and dumped out everything. He was practically ready to tear out his own hair, and it seemed like he had spent an entire morning looking for that one thing. Wanting to know what was up, I asked him. We started talking. He asked me, "Hey man, have you seen the map anywhere? I can't seem to find it." "Oh, well, where's Gary?" And I gave him the map last night so he could map out a little detour on the trip so he could visit a spring. Why don't you ask him? He probably knows," I answered. It was then that Ian said something that changed everything. "Gary? Who are you talking about? Do you mean Oliver? Don't tell me you thought his name was..." I explained. "No, I'm talking about Gary, the tall guy, kinda lanky." "You're joking, right?" He looked confused for a few seconds and made a questioning sound like a really old computer trying to process something moments before it catches on fire. The pieces clicked. and Ian shouted, "Who the fuck is Gary?" Getting the attention of everyone in the area. He was... some fucking guy asked you for our map in the middle of the night and you just fucking give it to him? You handed our stuff to some random stranger you met in the woods? I tried to explain myself and tell him that I knew Gary and that he did too, since I remember hiking with him the day before. But I couldn't find the words to convey that point. It was here that Jessica stepped in and asked what was going on, and he invented vitriol. How fucking stupid are you, Evan? Some random guy named Gary comes up to you in the middle of the night asking for our shit and you just give it to him. Jesus Christ. We needed that map to get around smoothly since the trails out here have not been cleared. Ian shouted for about 15 minutes while everyone became aware of our situation. Jessica managed to calm him down enough so that we could figure out our next move. Well, we weren't completely screwed, as Ian had memorized a large portion of the trail markers. It was going to be a lot harder to navigate the necessary junctions to bring us back around to our car. We packed all of our stuff, making sure that the guy hadn't taken anything else, and we left. The entire hike, I could feel Ian's eyes drilling into me. The last time I'd seen him this furious was just before we got into a fight with Aaron Fredlinger and beat him to a pulp. He got suspended for a week, and Aaron got a black eye, busted a lip. Never said anything about our mother again. Each time we came across a break in the path, we spent a few minutes while Ian tried to remember where to go. The fact that the trails had been closed and the paths were overgrown only served to make everything more difficult. I think that's how we made a wrong turn and began wandering to the faint trail. I don't actually know if that's where it went wrong since we didn't have the map at the time, but that's my best guess. Further away from home. Safety. Toward midday, tension had reached a critical point. Ian frequently mumbled things that would make a sailor blush, while Jessica tried to hide the fact that she was close to crying. Oliver attempted to lighten the situation by telling everyone that we would just follow the compass and we would get home safe and sound. Oliver's girlfriend didn't say much. She just stared quietly at her feet as she walked. I think she had the right idea since Lucas was constantly misplacing his footing and slipping. He looked like he had downed a fifth of vodka and was trying to walk home on a tightrope while being randomly shocked with a cattle prod. And the realization twisted something deep inside. It made me want to throw up. I stopped walking and began to talk to Lucas. Hey, what's going on with you, man? Ian, still pissed off at me, took this opportunity to vent a bit. Huh? What are you talking about now? Lucas is bumbling and twitching all over the place. What's wrong with him? Don't be a dick, man. You know he has multiple sclerosis. We told you before the hike started about his condition. As soon as he said it, the events came rushing back to me as clear as day. I recalled Ian pulling me aside and telling me about his friend's diagnosis and how it was likely going to be his last opportunity to undertake a long hike like this, so we had to help him and move slowly. I remember watching him scramble up the trail and thinking about our own mom and her illness. It brought back bittersweet memories of birthday wishes given to us from hospital beds and hearing her sob quietly to herself in the middle of the night. She thought we were asleep. Guilt flooded over me. I stepped forward to apologize to Lucas when it happened. Lucas growled at me the instant I stepped forward, dropped to a hunched position on his hands and feet, almost like his skin was bristling at a possible threat. I could see his broken, decaying teeth as he hissed at all of us before taking off at a hopping stride into the woods. He moved like one of those CGI monstrosities from the last Planet of the Apes. His shaking and unstable balance was replaced with a more natural and animalistic gait as he lopped into the distance and disappeared amongst the trees. The last thing I saw was what I assumed were his clothes, sloughing off his body, revealing that they weren't actually clothes, but gray folds of skin. Oliver was the first to talk. What the fuck? As soon as Oliver said those words, it was like a switch had flipped and set everyone to panic mode. We began to run along the trail as if it would do us any good. The only thought in my head was to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I think it took about 15 minutes for us to run out of energy with our heavy packs and the disorienting nature of the woods. As we tried to catch our breaths, I surveyed the area around us, came to a terrible realization. In our panic, we'd run off the path and were now even deeper into the woods. We tried to make sense of what we saw. I just remember Ian mumbling the same phrase over and over. What the hell was that? What the hell was that? What the hell was that? What the hell? The short answer is that it was Lucas. The long answer of it is this. There was no Lucas. Not really. I'm sorry for interrupting the story in the middle like this, but I think now is the best time to try to explain everything. I know how confusing this all seems with Gary and Lucas. The truth is, I did that because I don't think I could have appropriately explained it to you without first having you experience it from my eyes. I don't know what to call those things, but they do something to your mind. They insinuate themselves into your memories. They wrap themselves up in a wall of your recollections that, even though you know something is wrong, you can't quite put your finger on it. Your group of 4 friends could grow to 5 and you wouldn't be any wiser. A part of you will stupidly admonish you for wondering how many there were. And you look at it, and you recognize the face. You remember events. You remember getting drunk at the bar together. You remember them crying on your shoulder after a rough breakup. You remember everything that happened between you, but none of it's true. I don't know how it does it. It crawls into your head somehow. It makes you see things in a way that benefits them. It can mold memories, but it can't mimic human movement. It walks on all 4s, not 2 feet. It growls, it hisses and snarls, doesn't talk. It infiltrates, observes, and waits. It's hunting us, trying to drive us deeper into the woods. It was succeeding. We never reached much of a conclusion about what that thing was, but we did reach a consensus that we had to get out of here as soon as possible. I watched Ian as he looked around the forest and came to the same realization that I did. We were lost. We didn't tell the others. I think they realized that panicking would only get us in more trouble. Instead, he told us to follow him. With the shock of our encounter setting in, we could do nothing but follow his lead and hope it all worked out. As we walked, we could hear the sounds of distant animals yowling, calling out to each other. The terror of our situation deepened as the others whispered that those were the same sounds that we'd heard the first night out in the woods. Whatever this thing was, it was following us and calling out to other things in the area. At the time, I couldn't stop thinking about one of them barreling out of the underbrush and sinking its black and rotting teeth into my neck before the rest of the group could react. I remember brushing the thought off and mentally reassuring myself that there were 6 of us here, and we'd only actually encountered one of those creatures. As the day pressed on, we seemingly wandered south in an attempt to pick up another trail that would lead us back to the parking lot. I couldn't help but shake a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. It felt like I had forgotten some important deadline that I should have never forgotten about. It wasn't until Oliver mentioned his wish of being back in the car that Jessica stopped dead in her tracks. We all turned towards her, but knew what was coming the second she asked. We only took 1 car down, right? Ian snapped, more fearful than frustrated. Of course we did. Remember how cramped everyone is with the tiny-ass Prius with all of our camping gear smashed into the trunk? What about it? Jessica went white, as if this were the first time that Ian had ever raised his voice to her. She paused for a moment before asking, "How many of us are there right now? And how many does your car sit?" Ian's car sat 4 people comfortably, 5 uncomfortably. There were 6 of us out in the woods at that moment. Everything happened at once. Ian swore. Oliver's girlfriend gave a half shriek, half gasp, while I looked wide-eyed from person to person, trying to figure out which one of us didn't belong here. Sarah was the only one who managed to say something, and it was... She hadn't finished her words before her jaw popped open. I don't think it dropped open like she was astonished at something. It popped open like it was dislocated from her face. The space between her lips was a massive, sinky pink void of inflamed gums that looked at least a foot wide. She looked at us with dead and dull eyes as she slowly raised a twitching hand up to her jaw and tried to lock it back into a more human-esque appearance. She popped it back into place with a hollow-sounding squelch of meat and bone shifting into place, as if nothing was wrong about what just happened, before she tried to speak again. Me. Ian was the first to react. He stepped towards the failed facsimile of human and swung his walking stick at her face while bellowing, "Get out of here!" She hopped back from the first attack in a sloppy motion and landed on all fours. Her body shuddered as if an electrical jolt had passed through her. As she slowly backed away from all of us, facing Jessica the entire time. She hissed at us one last time before retreating deeper into the woods with a convulsing lope. It took a moment for all of us to regain our composure before we continued walking, while trying to look in every direction at once. I remember Oliver rambling as we walked. He kept asking, although no one was responding to him, "Did you see how it moved? Did you see how it moved? It was twitching like an epileptic." Did you ever see one of those documentaries about mad cow disease? That thing was twitching and moving like one of those infected cows. What the hell was that thing? Was it a person? What kind of person can do that to their body? It tried to talk to us. He rambled for hours before we had to stop. We had to tell him to shut up because we were worried about that thing hearing us, though that wasn't really the case. We made him stop talking because it only served in scaring us. Despite stopping for the night, none of us actually slept. We sat around the campfire and listened to a sound of high-pitched whining and yelping coming from all around us. It seemed like any time I actually got close to falling asleep, the calls would start up again, jolt me awake. We spoke in hushed whispers, tried to figure out what they wanted with us, even though none of us really wanted to answer that question. The hours dragged on almost endlessly before dawn broke, and we continued our hike. We spent Sunday hiking around and trying to find a familiar sight. Without any real sense of where we were, where we were going, our only hope was to stumble across another hiker or find an area with high enough vantage point that we could survey the entire area. Unfortunately, any elevations we climbed didn't afford a good view of the area, and it was extremely unlikely that we would find another hiker due to the fact that the trails had been closed. Even if we did, what were the chances that we would trust them and could be certain that it wasn't one of those things? Midway through the day, Ian whispered to me, "Count the people wearing backpacks. One of them is with us again." I casually looked over my shoulder and noticed that one of our group was walking without any gear, and they trailed behind us, but were still in our vicinity. They moved slowly, but didn't show any of the jerking movements of the previous two. The thought that it was learning to mimic our movement unsettled me. Without really thinking, I shucked off my backpack and approached the imposter. Before they knew what was happening, I shoved them as hard as I could. The instant my hands pressed into their shirt, it felt like something slick and warm. It felt give way, like the outer layer falling off of a rotten mango. Their shirt slid off their body into my hands, and I quickly realized it was their skin. This thing was actually naked, but gave the appearance of clothes by altering the color of its almost translucent skin. I dropped the skin that had slothed off, and it hit the ground with a wet slap. The creature toppled backwards and began yelping. I can only describe the sound like... Imagine you get out of your bed in the middle of the night to take a piss. As you're feeling your way through the darkness out of the room, you step on your dog's tail. Imagine that surprised yelp of pain and the surprise that comes along with it. Now forget the sound the dog makes, as it's nothing like what one of those things can vocalize. Just focus on that emotion, the sudden surprise and guilt. Here's the worst part. I shouldn't have felt bad. Those things were stalking and tormenting us. They were likely hunting us, and I felt bad for harming it. I shouldn't have felt bad about it, but it wanted me to. So I did. The thing writhed on the ground on its back for a few seconds, making a pitiful noise before it reached back with its arms and pushed itself upright, its hands in the balls of its feet, its joints popping wetly and its muscles and bones adjusting to fit its new position. That crab walked away while shrieking the entire time as Ian pursued it with his walking stick, hoping to catch up with it and cave its head in. It wasn't until the thing disappeared from sight that I realized that the shrieking wasn't just coming from the monster, but from Jessica as well. It was trying to mimic her response. With Ian gone, and Jessica's scream possibly drawing more of those things to us, I decided that I had to do something. I stepped forward and wrapped her in my arms. She was shaking like a leaf in the wind. I stroked her hair and whispered that it was over. She managed to choke out something about its face. All I could make out was that something was terribly wrong with its face. She calmed down as I told her everything was going to be all right. I didn't believe that myself, but it was the only thing I could think of that might bring her comfort. Ian returned, fuming that the monster escaped, and I awkwardly broke off the hug. Ian didn't say anything, just started walking. And we continued following him, hoping that he would find the way, but knowing that he probably wouldn't. Six hours later, we settled down for the night. It felt like we'd been going in circles all day and made absolutely no progress. And for all we knew, the thing could have been tinkering around with our memories and convincing us that familiar landmarks were now leading us deeper into the woods. I didn't tell the others, but I think I knew what those things wanted with us. They wanted to lead us deeper into the woods. They were trying to force us to exhaustion. And when we were too weak to defend ourselves, they would descend upon us and eat us. Oliver was right about that. If that thing is similar to us in any way, then those twitching spasms were likely some sort of prion disorder that came from eating humans. After eating some jerky, since we decided against having a fire and drawing more of them to us, we reached the conclusion that we would have to sleep in shifts. I volunteered for the first watch because my insight into the monster's behavior had robbed me from my desire to sleep. The others went off without so much as another word. They were exhausted, and it wasn't until an hour into my watch that I realized I was too. Even given the monster's grotesque appearance, everyone needs to sleep. Jessica joined me about 2 hours into my watch. She admitted that she couldn't sleep after our encounter with the creature, and I nodded in agreement. Both of us had seen something terrible that the others hadn't. We talked for a good 30 minutes about what we thought it was, or how everyone was handling it. She was worried about Ian. She confessed that he is acting erratic, and that it was scaring her. I wrapped my arm around her for a moment, and told her that we were all scared. She looked me in the eye, told me that she was glad I was there. And I felt something twist deep down inside me that I had buried a long time ago when I first met her. The longer she stayed with me on watch, and the more personal our conversation became. She confessed that she and Ian had been fighting a lot recently, and she was wondering if they were going to work it all out. At the start of their relationship, they were great together, and he made her feel wonderful, but there was something that didn't quite feel right. Like there was something missing. I listened to her talk about everything that was going on in her life. I knew I had to do something. I knew that if I didn't do it now, I would regret it. I had to tell her about the door. She listened quietly as I told her everything. It was the event that had precipitated my breakdown at work and my social anxiety disorder diagnosis at the therapist's office. Everything started off simply enough one Friday at work. I was in the lunchroom, eating my sandwich and reading a book as per my usual, while my coworkers talked about their plans for the weekend. One of them was having a housewarming party, and they were inviting everyone at work. I figured that the invitation would only extend to the people he was talking to, until he asked me if I'd be able to make it on Saturday. As it was the first time I had been invited to hang out after work, I chose to go. and I spent all of Saturday getting ready, planning what were interesting topics to bring up in case there was a lull in conversation, and the bottle of wine I was planning to give him as a housewarming gift. After psyching myself up, I left to go to the party with the bottle in hand, and my spirits high. I convinced myself that I was going to be the life of the party, and that maybe if I played my cards right, I could finally find a friend at work that would make time fly by instead of dragging on. It wasn't until I reached the house that false bravado began to crumple apart. I stopped in front of the neighbor's house, as everyone else already had a car parked there. It was then that I felt my heart beating, like I just ran a mile. I began heading up the driveway with the wine bottle in my hands, my palms sweaty. It wasn't until I reached the door that I realized that something was terribly wrong. All the excitement that I'd been building up since Friday afternoon was now replaced with something else. Apprehension. All those topics I'd thought up seemed boring, and all the reassurances I'd given myself seemed hollow. I didn't feel prepared for this at all. At this point, a small part of me whispered something that has stuck with me to this very day. It intimated that they never really wanted me to come out. They'd only given that invitation out of courtesy and didn't actually expect me to come out to their house. It said that if I knocked on the door, then I would be making a fool out of myself. It told me that I wasn't even comfortable in my own skin, so how could I even dare to imagine that they would enjoy my company? They wanted to celebrate with their friends. They didn't want to listen to me fumble for something to talk about. All those fears flashed in front of me, taunting me, demanding that I knock on the door and make myself look like an idiot. And that part of me told me that I was better off alone. And I listened. I turned around without even knocking on the door, and I left. No one had come in, and the music was playing loudly, so I doubt they would have heard me anyways. I shouldn't have been there in the first place. Maybe I saw them watching me from the window. Maybe I didn't. Maybe they were laughing at me as I drove away, frustrated and embarrassed. Maybe they went back to their party and joked about their social retard who seemingly freaked out and ran away from their house while I went home and cried in the shower. Maybe. Jessica listened as I told her the story, and she smiled sadly as I started to cry into her shoulder. All those feelings I had experienced outside of my coworker's house came rushing back. All the fear, foolishness, and phonetic failure smashed into me like waves on the shore. She whispered soothing words in my ear, waited for me to collect myself. Once I did, she pulled away and told me that it wasn't my fault. It was there under the moonlight, with her face inches away from mine, that I did the worst thing I've ever done in my life. I kissed her. It was slow, hesitant, romantic. I looked into her eyes and I saw her beautiful face. She pulled me towards her, and she leaned back. Lost in the moment, I held her against me while telling her all the things I should have said when I first met her, and realized that I loved her. I held her like that for a few moments, afraid that if I let her go, I would lose this perfect moment. She was warm. She smelled like wildflowers. She smelled like happiness. For the first time, what felt like a lifetime, I felt comfortable and content. I don't know when I drifted off, but I do remember waking up. In the love-drunk excitement of the previous night, I didn't think once about Ian or the consequences of my decision. I only thought about Jessica. I forgot that she was his girlfriend. What I did last night was a beautiful mistake. And I convinced her to cheat on him with me. I needed to tell him before the truth came out. I needed him to understand how I felt. I got up from the ground and stretched. Jessica was gone. I assumed that she had gone back to her sleeping role in the middle of the night. I walked over to Ian, who was just waking up. He read the sleep out of his eyes and asked me if I stayed up all night. The words bled out of me. Once I started, I couldn't stop. I don't know what happened, man. We were just talking one moment, and then the next, I didn't mean for it to happen. You know I love you, man. I wouldn't do anything to hurt you. It just happened. I know I can't take it back, but Jessica's cry of surprise cut me off before I could go any further. Both me and Ian turned to the sound of her distress, and we knew instantly what had happened. The backpacks with our compass, food, and water had been stolen. It knew. Don't you see it? God damn it. It knew that we could identify it without a backpack, and it couldn't shape its skin to take the appearance of one, so it stole them away from us. Now the next time it wormed its way into our group, we wouldn't be any the wiser. Jessica and I never talked that night. Jessica had never left my brother's side that night. They zipped their sleeping bags together. She didn't open up to me about her worries. I never actually kissed her. I poured my heart out to a thing wearing Jessica's skin that was in my arms. I confessed my truest feelings to an ersatz entity masquerading as a person. I felt sick. The others woke up quickly after hearing Jessica screaming. We quickly searched around the area, hoping to find some scrap of food or some indication of where our stuff had been taken to. We found nothing. It was long gone. We had no food, no water, and no hope. We had no way of telling when one of those things was hijacking our heads and pretending to be a part of the group so it could distract us. With our compass gone, we had no means of following a set direction and hoping to pick up a trail. In short, we were screwed, with a capital S. Oliver demanded to know what I was doing last night, and he wanted to know how I could be so careless as to fall asleep when I should have been watching over them and the gear. I lied and told him that someone had come around in the middle of the night and relieved me from my shift. I didn't mention that it was one of those things impersonating Jessica. I couldn't bear to look at either my brother or his girlfriend in the eyes at that point. Oliver started to yell, but stopped when he saw that I was on the verge of tears. I don't know if it was mercy or disgust that caused him to stop. But it doesn't matter either way. We gathered up the only thing that they hadn't taken in the middle of the night, their sleeping bags, and we continued walking. The hike without water or the prospect of food was unbearable. We were already exhausted, and the realization that we were soon going to be starving and dehydrated only served to sap more of our energy. Within a few hours, my mouth felt gummy and dry. When we were still under the canopy of leaves, the temperature was still in the high 80s, low 90s. It didn't take long for dehydration to set in. I kept licking my lips in an attempt to keep them moist, but I could feel them beginning to crack as my saliva began to dry up. As we walked, Oliver picked up his pace and caught up with me. I looked over at him and knew without him saying anything that another one of those things had joined our group. He whispered, "Don't look directly at it. Just keep it in the corner of your eyes. I think that is how it messes with your mind. It would explain why you remember it that one night, but the rest of us can't. You saw him, but the rest of us didn't. Don't get close, just keep it in the corner of your eyes. It's been trailing us for about a half an hour now. I think it just wants to watch us and follow us." I pretended to be cracking my neck and looked at the tag-along in my peripheral vision. It trailed behind us about 30 feet. In its resting state, its facial features appeared staticky. I could make out eyes and a nose, but it was constantly shifting and rippling like bubbling plastic. At this point, we were too tired to even bother chasing it off. We just kept walking and hoped that it wouldn't join the group. It seemed content to keep its distance, keep us in a line of sight. It followed us for about 2 miles before it broke off towards the trees with a shambling, awkward gait. We were too tired to even try to set up a shift system. We just huddled together in an attempt to convince ourselves that we were safer when we were closer together. But every time one of us got comfortable enough to drift off, those things would start making noise. The noise started off as high-pitched yips, whose sound seemed to travel for miles. As the night drew on, it grew more aggressive. I remember one time I was drifting off, hearing the grating rasp of my name. The things weren't just following us, they were learning. They were perfecting their mimicry. They The thought disturbed me more than the idea of them out there watching us in the darkness. How long would it take for them to become more human than human? What would they do once they were capable of walking amongst people again? I drifted off to sleep, with that thought beating around in my head like a man trapped inside a wall. We got up on Tuesday morning and left without a word. At this point, there was nothing to say. Some of us had been awake all night without food or water. The constant stress has completely worn us down. We continued hiking in the same direction we'd been going, in false hope that we would come across someone. In the end, our hike looked more like a death march. My feet were covered in blisters. They had ruptured and plastered the soles of my feet to my socks. Every step felt like I was tearing open the wounds a bit more. In an attempt to take my mind off the discomfort, I focused on my brother, who was walking in front of me. He wasn't as much walking as limping forward. He'd stopped using his walking stick and was dragging it behind him like a broken limb. I watched as he stepped over a rock. The walking stick slipped out of his hand. He kept dragging himself forward, as if nothing happened. He didn't even register it falling out of his hands. It was at that point I knew something was wrong. I knew that my brother wasn't my brother anymore. I quietly picked up the stick as I passed it. Amy went to call out to him and ask if he was all right, but I shushed her. I was so sure that one of those things had replaced him and was now leading us deeper into the woods. I realized that I would only have one chance at this. The instant it knew that we knew, it would try to run away. All it would take is one good swing to the back of its head. We'd be able to take out those things. The stick had a bit of weight to it, about 5 or 6 pounds, enough to crack open a skull if it was swung hard enough. I began walking faster, trying to avoid the underbrush that might give away my position. The thing wearing my brother's skin continued limping forward as I drew closer. I waited until I was within swinging distance before raising the stick above my head. My heart was beating in my chest and my hands were so sweaty, they felt like the stick would slide right out of my hands. I kept on moving forward, completely unaware of what I was about to do. I whispered, "I'm sorry," just before I swung the walking stick down with all of my strength. Ian turned to face me as he mumbled groggily, "I'm sorry for what?" My muscles locked and I stopped mid-swing, and the stick stopped just inches away from his face. He blinked in surprise before muttering, "Evan, what's wrong?" His voice sounded distant and empty. He was in between awake and asleep. It was then that I knew the extent of his condition. He was pale and looked like the slightest breeze would blow him over. He wasn't one of those things. He was delirious from dehydration, sleep deprivation, and starvation. The walking stick fell out of my hand and bounced on the ground next to us. I dropped my tongue across my lips and felt like I was licking sandpaper. I whimpered, "Jesus, Ian, I thought you were one of those things. I almost... Oh, God, I'm so sorry." He didn't react to my apology. He just turned around, continued walking in the direction we were going in. Amy just watched everything unfold, numbly, before she started following him. Oliver shook his head sadly, but didn't look any better. His eyes were glazed, his lips were cracked and red from rubbing at them. I watched my brother shambling forward. It reminded me of one of those voodoo movies where someone is put into a trance and forced to walk until they die from exhaustion. His mouth hung open. He moved like he was being dragged along on puppet strings. I picked up the walking stick and began to follow them. I wondered how much longer he had left, and what any of us could do if he just fell over and stopped walking. I wondered how much longer any of us had. I don't know how long we walked. Everything melted together in a muddled malaise at the time. I remember losing my footing, tripping a few times, but I barely felt it. The third time, I didn't even realize I was lying on the ground until Jessica stepped on me as she was passing by. There was no apology. She was too far gone to recognize what she had stepped on. I dragged myself to my feet and felt lightheaded, but continued putting one foot in front of the other. The 5th time I fell, I wondered if it would have been better for me just to lie down and wait to die. An excited yap behind me from one of those things drove me to my feet. It wasn't until we bumped into a sign for Little Bear Canyon that I realized how close we were to salvation. The post for Little Bear Canyon also had a branching sign that pointed in the direction of TJ Corral, which was only a few miles from where we started at the Gila Cliff Dwellings if we walked along Route 15. Ian was heading in the right direction and we were almost home free. In my excitement, I began calling to the others to let them know that the end was near. I looked around and shouted, "Jessica, Ian, Oliver, Heather, Amy, I know where we need to..." And the words died in my lips. I counted the names. I realized it wasn't over yet. And the others kept moving as if they hadn't heard me talking. The imposters shuffled alongside us, and for once, it was easy to identify them. I don't know whether or not they had let down their guard after seeing our conditions, but this one was obvious. She moved slowly, but her movements didn't convey her exhaustion. Everyone else was sweating and looked like the Walking Dead, but she was fine. I waited for her to get close enough to follow the trail the others were going down, before I raised Ian's walking stick and growled, "Turn around right fucking now! I can see you!" She turned around slowly. I felt my heart skip a beat. She looked almost exactly like Jessica, except for a brown tinge to her hair. She could have been her twin. I knew what it was planning before it even opened its mouth and asked, "What are you doing, Evan?" "Don't call me that," I winced. "What are you rambling about? Please move out of the way. We're almost safe from those things." "I know what you are." Heather turned white at the realization. She began speaking quickly. No, I'm not one of those things, Evan. Please, Evan, you have to remember, there were 6 of us. Those things want us to think that there are only 5 so that they can take one of us out without the others caring. Those things don't want us all. They only want the weakest one. Please, let's go before they catch..." "Shut up!" I snapped. I raised my walking stick in my hand and brandished it at her. "Think about it, Evan. Do I move like one of those things? Do I speak like them? That should be enough proof that I'm human." No. Ian's my brother. Jessica's his girlfriend. No, I'm your girlfriend. I sat on your lap on the car ride. Please don't kill me, please. Evan, I love you. Don't you remember? Evan, I love you." I lowered the stick that was in my hand as the memories bombarded me. I had met her one night when my brother forced me to go out to the club with him. Heather had been sitting at the bar all night drinking. It wasn't until she tried to stand up and fell into my arms that we actually talked. I remember lazy Sundays in bed watching cheesy B sci-fi movies. I remember holding her close to me after making love and hearing her whisper sweet nothings in my ear. I remembered our life together. I rasped, "Heather, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't know." She cooed. "Evan, it's not your fault. It's not your fault." She went to touch me, and I sprang back like I'd been bitten by a snake. The instant I heard those words, I knocked. The stick caught her unaware by the side of the face. I felt her jaw give way under the sudden force of the attack. She blurred through her broken teeth. The second strike dented her temple as the temporal bone shattered, and she kept trying to talk, but it was too late. Too much damage had been done. The door was shut to me now. I kept swinging the walking stick down on her head until it splintered and snapped. I looked at her twitching body, and I saw my brother watching in horror. "Heather. Oh my God." I spoke through gritted teeth and regarded him with red-rimmed eyes. "Come on. We have to go." He went to keep talking, but I walked past him. I didn't want to explain it to him. He eventually ran ahead, invigorated with the prospect of finding rescue on the road. I looked behind me one last time. The last thing I saw was one of those things, dragging away Heather's corpse. It looked emaciated and half mad with starvation. At that very moment, I wasn't afraid of the thing. I just felt pity. Whether or not it forced that emotion on me, I'll never know. I turned away and caught up with the others on Route 15. We were on the road for 15 minutes before we managed to flag down a car and an ambulance was called for us. The doctors said that our exposure to the elements, combined with our starvation and dehydration, triggered our auditory and visual hallucinations. It's a typical response you'd expect to hear from any half-dead rambling about creatures warping in their flesh and memories to drive us to the brink of death so that they can prey on us when we're at our weakest. We spent a week there while receiving treatments, recounting our horrific experiences and then subsequent psych evaluations before we were released. Ian and Jessica refused to talk with me about it. I don't really know Oliver or Amy, so that's off the table too. They just want to forget. I can't forget. Here's the thing. I still remember Nadia asking me to help her find her lighter. I recall staying up late and talking with her by the campfire while she smoked like a chimney. I recognized Gary's terrible puns that he'd make about almost everything, and Luca's determination at hiking this trail while slowly succumbing to the effects of his multiple sclerosis. I can recall whispering sweet nothings to Jessica under the glow of the moonlight. I can recall that clear as day, even months later. I know the conversation we had word for word. I can remember that feeling of her skin against mine and the smell of her hair as I pressed myself against it. When I reached that one true moment of connectivity, I remember Heather pleading, begging me not to kill her. Despite writing this all months later, I can see all those things clearly. Sometimes late at night, I can even remember driving up to Gala National Park with Heather sitting on my lap, playfully grinding against me and telling me how fun our hike was going to be. Sometimes I think about that memory more than I should, since I can't talk to my brother or Jessica about this. I have to find some other outlet. I guess I'm writing all this for that one reason. Catharsis. In the end, I keep wondering if what I did was right. Did I make the right choice? I want you to read this and tell me I had no other option. That risk one of them escaping into the city forced my hand. I know that's not the case. I could have walked away or tried to scare her off, but I didn't. What kind of person can look into someone's eyes, remember all the things we did and the life we had, and do what I did? Who can have all those memories and end everything so casually? It doesn't matter if none of it's real, because in that moment, it was to me. Who can look at someone and feel such love for them before you kill them? The answer to that question is simple now that I ask myself. I just don't like the answer.
Every few years, my family moved to a new town. We had to. Dad's job made us. We'd spent a couple years in Marysville, California, a couple in Odenton, Maryland, and a couple in Dubuque, Iowa. I lived in 5 different cities before I was ready for the 7th grade. Now we were in Dayton, Ohio. You really get used to the Air Force moving you around from place to place. Dad made it seem like an adventure. My older sister, Karen, hated it because she always left behind her best friend. I guess her best friends didn't know about the internet. But she was right. It was tough to make new friends in a new place. Mom made sure the move to Dayton would be done before the school year started so we could get to know the neighborhood and maybe make some new friends. It was always harder to make friends when you just appear in the middle of a school year. And Mom was right, too. That summer, I found a bunch of kids my age in the neighborhood. They were pretty much like me, Air Force brats from someplace else, just looking for other kids with the same interests. There was Tommy Reynolds, super jock and natural leader of our group. Second in command was Richie Stevens. Kenny Downs was the joker of the gang, and I was, well, I don't know what I was. I guess I was 12, and that was all I needed to be. And we had an awesome summer. On the first day of school, Karen refused to give me a ride. She explained that I was in middle school and she couldn't be seen with a middle school kid, even if it was her brother, because she was now in high school, so I had no choice but to take the bus. I didn't mind the big yellow bus. in some of the places where I'd lived. I'd have to walk to school. That's why Dubuque really sucked for me. I mean, I'm not an athlete, but I'm no blob on the couch either. Why get all sweaty in the summer and frozen in the winter walking to school? Besides, riding the bus was good enough for my friends, so it was good enough for me. It didn't hurt that the school system had house-to-house pickups either. Our time on the bus was spent catching up with whatever happened the night before and figuring out what we were going to do that day. Sometimes we had mischief on our minds, but mostly we wanted to have a plan of attack for lunch and study hall. My job, since I was one of the first kids on the route, was saving seats for Tommy, Richie, and Kenny. One day in October, before Halloween but after the leaves on the trees had turned colors, the bus rolled up to Tommy's house to start a new week. The big brake screeched like a cat caught in a fence gap and puffed fumes from its twin tailpipes. We waited a couple seconds before the driver tapped the horn. I wiped the fogged-up bus window to see what was going on. Tommy's door opened a couple seconds later, but it wasn't Tommy coming to meet the bus. In the semi-frosted window of the storm door stood his mom. Her blue robe was as messy as her hair, and she looked really pale. The expression on her face was blank. Her eyes looked hollow like a doll's. She waved a floppy hand to the bus to keep going. "Tommy sick or something?" Rich asked. "I don't know," I said. "I thought I saw, nothing." "Probably got his period." Kenny laughed. "You're safe this month, Richie boy." "You're a dick." Rich punched Kenny in the arm. I watched Tommy's house as the bus lurched into gear and slowly pulled away. I ignored Kenny and Rich insulting each other and kept staring at Tommy's house. I don't know if it was because my breath was fogging up the bus window, but it was as if Tommy's mom was there one minute and gone the next. Tommy's front door closed with a quick, hard slam as we sped off to the next pickup. We all wondered what was going on with Tommy when we got to school. We knew his family had planned a weekend trip up to the Lake Erie Fear Fest. We put all Tommy thoughts on hold when the first bell rang. We'd discuss it later at lunch. Unfortunately, we came up with nothing over the day's lunch of beef and noodles. Rich had gotten the most recent text from Tommy on Saturday morning. Tommy mentioned something about getting a late start because his dad had to talk to the contractor about finishing the porch while they were upstate. The most frustrating part was that the principal had a ban on bringing cell phones to school, so we'd just have to wait until we got home. I didn't even have my coat off before I grabbed my phone from the charger and dialed Tommy's number. It rang 3 times and went to voicemail. I texted him too, but got nothing back. I texted Kenny and Rich, but they had nothing to report. I took the phone up to my room and changed into a pair of sweats. Since Dad had rules about getting on the internet before dinner and homework, I quickly scarfed down my food, showed him my finished homework, and excused myself. By the time I got online, Kenny and Rich were already chatting about Tommy. They had nothing new. I mentioned how creepy his mom looked, and Rich told me that's the face she always had, especially when Kenny would come around. We reassured each other that we'd see Tommy bright and early on the bus tomorrow, and gamed until my computer curfew kicked in. I almost forgot to put my phone back on the charger. Another one of Dad's rules. So I went downstairs, plugged it into the charger, and went up to bed. Morning came too early. I rolled out of bed and turned off my annoying alarm clock. I could feel the chill outside my window, so I slipped into my school clothes and headed downstairs. As usual, Mom had breakfast ready. My sister and I were mostly civil at the breakfast table to save Mom's last nerve before we went off to school. I put on my coat and waited in the cold October morning for my ride to school. Kenny dropped into the seat in front of me as the bus rumbled to the next stop. A few minutes later, we rolled up to Richie's house. No Richie. The bus doors opened with a rush of cool air as the driver looked closer. The kids on the bus began complaining as me and Kenny wiped our fogging windows. A pale hand slipped between the curtain of the window next to Richie's door and waved the bus on. "WTF?" Kenny said. He's sick too? I said. Tommy probably gave him whatever he had, said Kenny, as the bus doors creaked shut. What are you talking about? Did you get a text from Tommy? I shook my head. Rich said Tommy texted him last night. He did? Yeah, you already logged off. He said Tommy was on his way over to his house. Did he text you too? Nope, Kenny shrugged. But I'm not Tommy's butt buddy. How about you? I forgot to check my phone before I left the house this morning. I wouldn't worry about it. They're probably over there smoking each other's poles. Kenny nudged me with an elbow. Yeah, I guess. We didn't say much about Tommy or Richie that day. But I knew we were both thinking about them. I don't think we wanted to talk about our fearless leader or his sidekick being laid up in a bed puking sick. Or worse. I mean, they were jocks. If some bug put them out of action for 4 days, we certainly didn't want to catch it. So the two of us didn't bring it up during lunch or on our bus ride home. Tommy and Richie would text us. I checked my phone. No messages or voicemails. I can't say why, but I had a bad feeling about all of this. No Tommy, no Richie, no information. Something just didn't smell right. After dinner, Dad allowed us to watch some TV with him while we finished up our homework. His choice was always the local 6 o'clock news and a couple reruns of some sitcom that was funny when he was younger. I was on the last algebra problem from Miss Clayton's class when I snapped to attention. On the TV, a reporter stood in front of yellow police tape and a couple of police cars.
Behind me is where a family became the victims of a grisly multiple homicide. Police received a call from neighbors early this morning about a smell coming from the home of Roger Reynolds. When police arrived on scene, they entered the home only to discover the family of 5 had been murdered,
offered the well-dressed reporter. The news showed an interview. The banner under the man stated he was Homicide Detective John Pickering, Dayton PD.
As this is an ongoing investigation, we can't say too much. However, we can confirm Colonel Reynolds and his family are deceased.
He had a look of total frustration as he finished with,
It's just a mess in there, that's all I can say.
Detective Pickering turned away from the camera. The news cut back to the reporter who was live on the scene.
Colonel Reynolds' family included his wife and 3 children.
They showed a photo as they read each name.
Emily, Sarah, and Thomas. Sources inside the Dayton Police Department told Channel 7 News the family had been dead for some time before the horrific discovery of the bodies this morning. The medical examiner estimates the family was brutally murdered either Saturday or Sunday. In an exclusive to Channel 7, we have learned the family members suffered stab wounds and were possibly drained of their blood.
No, I whispered to no one as the reporter buzzed on. Isn't that one of your school buddies, Sport? Dad asked. Yes. I couldn't offer anything else. My mind was spinning. Sport, are you okay? I jumped up from the table and grabbed my phone. I gotta call Kenny, I said as I hurried up the stairs. I expected Dad to protest, but I think he felt my urgency. Before Kenny had a chance to say hello, I asked, Did you just see the news? I don't watch that crap. Quick, get online and check the Channel 7 website, I told him as I surfed over to the page. Holy shit, was all Kenny could manage. What do we do? What do you mean, what do we do? We know Tommy texted Richie on Monday. And if they were killed over the weekend, then Kenny cut me off. Tommy never sent that text. Exactly. So what do we do? I don't know. I could almost hear the wheels spinning in Kenny's brain. Have you talked to Richie yet? No, have you? No. We need to get him in on this too. I'll call him and send a tweet. You text him and I am him on Facebook. Got it. Kenny sounded lost. But what if Richie doesn't get back to us? I had no answer. A sinking feeling grabbed my stomach. We'll think of something. That sinking feeling didn't go away as I called and tweeted Richie. There was no response. I left my phone next to the computer and sent him an email, too. Nothing. I wanted to take the phone with me to bed, but I knew Dad would ground me for a week. I couldn't afford that right now. So I ran the phone downstairs and put it in the cradle. Sleeping was not easy that night. In the morning, I rubbed my eyes open and got myself together for school. I did make sure to check my phone to see if I had any messages. 0. So I zipped up my coat and stepped outside to wait for the bus. The bus stopped at Kenny's house. Nobody came out. The driver honked. Still no Kenny. The bus driver shrugged and put the bus in gear. This was repeated at Richie's house. I felt queasy as panicked thoughts raced through my mind. As the bus rumbled past Tommy's house, a chill ran through my body looking at the big yellow X of police tape across Tommy's door. I felt as empty as the seats I'd saved for my missing friends. At school, a few people asked me where Richie and Kenny were. I had no answer. Principal Watkins stopped me in the hall to let me know grief counselors were in the school. He told me he knew Tommy was a friend and the counselors were there if I needed them. I thanked him and went off to my next class. I didn't have any grief to talk about. All I had was a big ball of fear knotting in my gut. When I got home, I texted Richie and Kenny. Once again, I received no answer. Dad hadn't gotten home yet, so I said hello to Mom and I headed for my room. I fired up my computer to check and see if anybody had IM'd or emailed. No emails, no tweets. I did see the red notification on the messages icon in Facebook. I clicked on it and there was a message from Kenny at 10:34 last night. Now, he's getting online against the rules of dinner/homework/internet, but doesn't mention that he knows he's breaking the rules because this is now a crisis. Hey, curfew boy. Richie boy texted me. He's coming over tonight so we can strategize. Don't you wish you could be here? Oh, shit, was all I could think. I immediately headed downstairs. I had an overwhelming urge to get to Kenny's house as soon as possible, but I had to get past Mom first. Keeping as calm as possible, I lied to my mom that I needed to go over to Kenny's house because he had something I needed to finish my homework. Since Kenny's house was only 2 blocks away, I told her I'd be back in time for dinner. She was busy watching her soap opera and waved me away. Then I heard the TV.
We interrupt our regularly scheduled programming for a special bulletin from the Channel 2 news team. Here's Brian Panade.
I continued putting on my coat as I moved to see the TV screen.
In as many days, our city has experienced a second gruesome set of murders. We go to Marcus Mills, who is live on the scene.
In the few seconds they took to switch from the studio to the location, I immediately recognized the house being swarmed by police officers. It was Richie's.
Thanks, Brian. I'm standing in front of a house on Sycamore Avenue that has become a terrifying crime scene.
The report went to a pre-recorded segment. As the reporter's voice talked over the segment, the footage showed 2 men with coroner's office on the back of their jackets, wheeling out a stretcher with a body bag on it.
Early this morning, police responded to a call from Vic Aykroyd, a concerned neighbor who had stopped off at this house to borrow a garden tool. He had no idea what he would find.
The TV showed the neighbor.
Yeah, I stopped over about 9 to see if Earl would let me use his hedge trimmer. I wanted to get one more clear cut before we get our first snow. Anyway, I knocked on the door, but nobody answered. So I went back to that old cellar door in the back. That's where he keeps his tools and such. And it wasn't locked. I didn't think he'd mind, so I went into the basement. I found Earl and Enid and Tammy and Rich all trussed up to the floor, choice pale as ghosts. And there was this old wash tub filled with blood sitting in the middle of the room. Really disturbing.
Back to the reporter and more morning footage.
The victims, 45-year-old Earl Williams, 40-year-old Enid Stevens, and their 2 children, Tammy, age 9, and Richard, age 13, were all pronounced dead on the scene by the medical examiner. No further details have been offered by Dayton police. Some are speculating these murders may be related. If true, Dayton might have joined the ranks of other cities with a serial killer living in their midst. We spoke to several...
I didn't want to hear the rest. I was out the door in a flash. I ran as fast as I could to Kenny's house, hoping, praying I'd find him home and mocking me for being all sweaty and out of breath. I made better time hopping a few fences and cutting through a few yards. I ended up jumping into Kenny's backyard. That's when I saw light creeping out from the basement window. In all the time I'd known Kenny, we'd never gone into the basement. He told me it was filled with so many boxes of junk and other crap that it was hard to move around down there. Like the best wargamers, I slowly approached the window. I made sure to step lightly and to make as little noise as possible. It seemed like an eternity before I crouched down and looked into the window. Actually, if it wouldn't have been for a small chunk of glass missing from the window, I would never have been able to see anything, because all the basement windows had been covered with gray spray paint from the inside. I guess it was something his dad had done to keep prowlers from casing the place. I wiped away the spiderwebs from the paint and lightly pressed my eye up to the opening. I really don't want to describe what I saw through that half-inch wide hole in the glass, but the details have been burned into my mind. For years, what I saw in Kenny's basement haunted my dreams. Sometimes I'd wake up screaming, cold sweat soaking into my sheets. The first thing I noticed was the work lights on a stand off to the side, illuminating the entire basement in a harsh light. Not that a well-lit room meant anything, as sagging cardboard boxes blocked my view of most of the basement. But I could see Kenny, and he was looking very pale. My friend lay on a ratty weightlifting bench, but it was not because he wanted to lift weights. Kenny was tied to the bench by a bunch of bungee cords, and he'd been gagged. That's when I saw the small, dark red tube running from his arm to the big tin bucket on the floor. Oh, the tube wasn't red, it was the blood running through the tube. Suddenly Kenny's drooping eyes snapped open. He was staring at something past his feet that I couldn't see from my window crack. Then a thick shadow stretched across Kenny. It was nothing supernatural. It was the kind a person would cast if they stepped in front of a powerful work light. But the way it slowly crossed my friend's helpless body creeped me out. Kenny started to struggle furiously and scream through the gag, but I could tell he was too weak to put up a decent fight. He couldn't break free even if he wasn't being drained of his blood.
Don't be like that, Kenny.
The voice was low and sounded more like somebody crumpling thick paper.
It's impolite.
The shadow and voice finally appeared in my limited view. It was definitely a man. Maybe 6 feet tall and stocky. He wore dark pants with a dark long-sleeve shirt. Over that he had a thick rubber butcher's apron and thick rubber gloves. I couldn't see his face because of the black ski mask and circular mirrored sunglasses he wore. He walked over to Kenny like he had all day and placed a gloved finger to his gagged lips. The man looked in the bucket. He stroked Kenny's hair and didn't speak for what felt like minutes.
In no time you fall asleep and wake up with your parents in heaven. That is my gift to you.
Kenny continued to yell into his gag as his tears flowed. I'm sure the man had a smile under his mask as he continued stroking Kenny's hair. It was at that moment I cursed not bringing my phone with me. Even though Kenny was my friend, it made no sense to try to rescue him. I had to get out of there and get to a phone, but I was glued to the spot.
You'll see I'm right, Kenny,
the man continued.
If you don't believe me, why don't you ask your little friend?
The man slowly turned his head in my direction and stared at the spray-painted window I was peeking through. His mirrored glasses caught the light of the work lamps and seemed to focus the rays in the little spotlights that put spots in my peeking eye. I dared not move because movement would give me away. It was then he waved a gloved hand at me. I don't think I even touched the ground as I flew through yards and over fences to get back to the safety of my home. I burst through the door like a wild animal and proceeded to babble to my parents. I guess they understood enough of what I was saying that they immediately called the police. The police showed up at my house in minutes. I calmed down enough to tell them the story. They immediately sent cruisers over to Kenny's house, but they were too late to save Kenny or his parents, or catch the killer with the mirrored glasses. The police let us know the killer had used Tommy's phone to text Richie. Then, after he killed Richie's family, he used Richie's phone to text Kenny. Each time he sent a short text, "I'm coming over." However, they only shared this information when I received the same text 2 days later from Kenny's cell. Dad wasted no time getting us the hell out of Ohio. He got an emergency reassignment to Shriver Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which was the farthest assignment Dad could manage on such short notice. The Dayton police were not happy with the move, but my dad used more than a few colorful words to convince the cops that they were not going to stop us from moving. All of this happened 3 years ago. Although I can never forget the tragedies in Dayton, I've never spoken about it until now. It's not that the time is right or anything. I don't think telling this story to anyone will help heal the wounds, The pain goes too deep. There's only one way I'll escape the nightmares. I stole my dad's 9mm semi-automatic Glock. It's sitting next to my laptop, loaded with black Talon bullets. They're so hardcore they can rip through body armor. I shouldn't need more than one of those bad boys to get the job done. The best part is that my mom and dad are at some base function that will keep them out late. I also convinced my sister to hang out at her dorm instead of coming home. They can't be here tonight now that I must do what I must do. Will I have the courage to pull the trigger? I don't know. But I think I can. I have to. 30 minutes ago, I received a voicemail from one of my friends here in Colorado. He had gotten sick the day before and missed school. The voice on the message sounded like the crumpling of heavy paper. The message was just 3 words.
I'm coming over.
My name is My name is Ada. My name is Aim. I've been writing these words over and over for the past 12 hours, writing to remind myself. Yet no matter how many times I try to write it, it never lasts through the final stroke of the pen. I suspect it won't be long before the memory fades as well. I just hope this journal finds its way into someone's hands. Anyone's hands. Please, whoever you are, please remember me. June 5th, 1964. Since before my university years, I have been fascinated by ancient Egypt, the cradle of civilization where gods and empires rose from untamed sands. These stories of our beginnings lay buried in silent tombs for thousands of years. The Valley of the Kings held answers to many mysteries, and sometimes new mysteries for the finding. A wealth of revelations and surprises, and its allure drew me to the life of a historian many years ago. Above and beyond the profession, unveiling these wonders has been my greatest pleasure. To that end, today is a momentous day for my career. Until today, my research had been limited to secondary sources. As one might imagine, gaining access to original texts and artifacts can be a challenge. Yet I have the greatest fortune of receiving a rare donation concerning my most recent subject of intrigue, courtesy of a generous private collector. Unfortunately, for the sake of privacy, he wishes to retain anonymity in all publications. Still, though I cannot credit him for his contribution, I am most grateful. My current work involves the end of the 18th dynasty, family line of Akhenaten, and his controversial rejection of the old pantheon. Their reign is generally accepted to have ended with the death of his son, Tutankhamun. However, the contents of the boy king's burial chamber would suggest otherwise, namely the 2 fetuses buried alongside of him, each in its own sarcophagus. One died in what appeared to be its 7th month of prenatal development, the other in its 5th. Their identities and the causes of their miscarriage are, as of yet, unknown. My anonymous benefactor will be supplying me with those very same sarcophagi. Per request, he has sent them to my office at the University of Southampton. Hopefully, their examination will provide me with a valuable lead in answering these questions once and for all. The package will arrive by month's end, and I am eager to begin. June 29th, 1964. The package arrived this morning, though in a rather precarious state, I must say. left unattended at my office door rather than the security desk as requested. The package itself was less than sturdy, hardly adequate protection for such priceless treasures. I'll be sure to voice my concern to the delivery company in the near future. The artifacts are no worse for wear, however, and they are beautiful indeed. My benefactor kept them pristine, clearly not in a dusty storage facility, as I might have imagined. 2 tiny sarcophagi, adorned in black and gold, each containing an even smaller sarcophagus, like Russian nesting dolls, and their shriveled remains would have rested therein. I had expected them to be brittle, yet they weathered the ages with surprising integrity. Unfortunately, the bodies themselves are unavailable to me. They are closely guarded at another facility, granting strictly limited access, and rightly so. Regardless, the coffins alone are a promising starting point in my research all the same. I will begin my work at once. July 10th, 1964. The coffins have been in my possession for over a week now, and they provide more questions than answers. The photographs I had seen before their arrival showed no obvious signs of identity, so I suspected a more careful examination would be necessary. Yet they've yielded nothing. No names, of course. No epithets, no prayers, no symbols of protection. Not even the smallest indication of ritualistic practice concerning such deaths. That these fetuses were embalmed and entombed in royal fashion, yet put to rest with no marks of distinction, is a confounding enigma. I can only assume that they were Tutankhamun's miscarried children, based on how near they were found to his resting place. And even that poorly supported conclusion lends no clue to the circumstances surrounding their deaths. Clearly, these two were of great importance. Their bodies were treated with the same care as a king. Why then would they die nameless? Why would it be permitted? This is no folly of incompetence or neglect. No, I can say with confidence that they were deliberately omitted. How very puzzling. July 23rd, 1964. At the height of my frustration, I have made an astonishing discovery. To be honest, I am surprised that I am the first to notice it, or at least the first to mention it. At the foot of one of the inner sarcophagi, near the edge of the lip beneath the lid, I found a very fine, nearly undetectable slit in the clay. It could easily be mistaken for a stress fracture, and I almost dismissed it as such. However, when I adjusted my desk lamp, that's when I saw it. Something deep in the slit, reflecting the faintest touch of light. After probing with a needle and a pair of tweezers, I was able to extract a small, tightly folded piece of papyrus reed parchment. Of course, it did not age as well as the clay sarcophagus, made thin and weak at its ancient seams. Keeping it intact whilst unfolding was a delicate and trying task, yet mostly successful. The last bit adheres to itself rather strongly and with evident purpose. The ink is quite faded, but I have been able to discern the following. Let their names die with them, sealed in earth and forgotten. They were called. Doubtless the last bit conceals what would have been their names in life had they survived. Though risky, I may be able to undo the last few folds with the careful application of a razor blade and a non-corrosive solvent. But I must use caution, as this could very well be the key to solving this riddle, thereby documenting a solid conclusion to an important period in Egypt's history. July 24th, 1964. I've been staring at this blank page for a while now, trying to find the words to describe what I experienced last night. It sounds ludicrous, no matter how I think to phrase it, so I've been trying to rationalize it. It may be due to lack of sleep or perhaps mounting frustration, perhaps oncoming sickness or feverish hallucinations. I am uncertain, but I cannot fathom the alternative. Yet, for all my reasoning, I cannot dismiss the chill crawling over my skin. The last of the parchment's folds gave more easily than I expected, requiring very little pressure at all, and they revealed what I now struggle to explain. I understood the characters that I saw. I understood their meanings and uses individually. I understood the sounds they should have made. But together, as I saw them in that state, they evoked no thought, only a dense fog of confusion, and any semblance of meaning dissolved from my mind the moment I looked away. Even as I attempted to copy the characters I saw, to put them to paper, I found that I was unable. I understood the lines that composed them, yet I could not move my hand to recreate them. It is as though these words, these names, refused to be repeated. Yet I unfolded the last bit. I swear that I felt a gust of cold air rush over me. I heard a wordless whisper in my ear calling me. It's a peculiar feeling, and as I labor to overcome it, I feel something dreadful surrounding these names. Something dark. What in the world have I disturbed? August 12th, 1964. I have ceased my study. I would return the artifacts to my benefactor if they did not frighten me so. To be in the same room, to see them sitting atop my desk as I stand at a distance is unbearable. The parchment is nowhere to be found, and for that I am grateful. I dare not set eyes upon those characters again, for just the one glance will certainly haunt me for life as it is. I've had horrible, relentless visions since the night I unveiled them, visions of suffering and regret. I will not set foot in that office again, not while those terrible things remain. I will be leaving the city tonight. I do not know where I'll go, but I am compelled to flee. I cannot abide this place. It's been tainted. I saw the jackal last night. He spoke of false gods. October 18th, 1964. I'm running now. Not home or anywhere specific, just away. I have to keep moving or they'll find me again. The two little girls with silver crowns watching from the darkness. Wherever I go, they find me, and the shadows rattle like scarabs beneath their feet. Always the smell of sand in the wind, and they appear before me. They tell me they bring the wrath of the lion, the justice of Sekhmet. They tell me their names, a sound my mind cannot understand or tolerate. A sound not for the living. I must run. The names torment me. No gods before Ra. As are his faithful, so is the fate of Aiden. December 6th, 1964. I returned to the university today, perhaps in the hopes that I may appease the dead, that I may somehow give their names back to the void, and the unborn daughters might leave me in peace. I returned as a stranger. Colleagues had forgotten my name, old friends had forgotten my face, and my office, where my curse began, had never existed. In its place, I found nothing more than a wall connecting the rooms that once sat to its left and right. A wall yellowed with the same age as the building itself. I'll find no asylum here. I will move on, but I grow weary, and the Lion Woman awaits my resignation. May 30th, 1965. The months have crawled by, stripping away my former life little by little. I am without a home. I live in my car and I steal to survive. Nobody seems to notice me anymore. They forget me as quickly as they see me. Nobody listens to my cries for help, and I sometimes believe they may not even hear my voice. I press on through the streets as a broken man, trudging more than walking, and they move past me without a second glance. My parents no longer know me. They never had a son. I have become a ghost, a lost cause with nowhere left to turn. My car broke down 2 days ago, no time to find another, no time to stop. I flee on foot. I sleep only where I lose consciousness. I pray they don't take me in my sleep, and I count my blessings when I wake where I collapse. But I always see them waiting for me in the last moments of dusk before sunrise. I've taken shelter in a sewage tunnel for the night, but this is where I will likely find my final rest. I've grown too tired to stand. I cannot go on. I await my judgment. May 31st, 1965. When the sun last set, Aiton's gaze turned from me as it did from them. The boy king came to me, adorned in his burial garb, and he spoke with the hiss of the cobra. He gave me the names of his daughters, and with them an understanding. To know faith in Aiton is to know the anger of Ra. To know Aiton's faithful is to know the wrath of Sekhmet. To remember the banished ones is to face the void. And so, in exchange for their names, he took my own. This will be my last entry. Here, on this page, I leave my last words to the world, though they may never be known. Each letter's ink lifts from the page like ash on a breeze. And as I lay here dying, slowly collapsing to dust, without the essence of a self, I cannot help but reach out to another in vain. I cannot help but try to leave a memory. Please remember me. My name is...
Chilling tales for dark nights.